There is a piece of paper in a library in Kansas that most people have never heard of. It was written in pencil in a hurry by a man who had just made a decision that would determine the fate of Western civilization. The handwriting is controlled. The grammar is precise. The date on it is wrong, a small error born of exhaustion. And that tiny mistake tells you more about the state of the man who wrote it than any biographer ever could. The note accepted in advance full personal responsibility for the failure of an operation that hadn't happened yet. The man who wrote it then folded it, put it in his breast pocket, and went back to work. That man was Dwight David Eisenhower. That night, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel. The note was never meant to be read. We are very lucky it was found. I want to be upfront with you about something before this documentary runs another minute. The story you think you know about Eisenhower, if you know it at all, is probably incomplete in ways that are going to genuinely surprise you. Most people carry one of two versions. The first version is the wartime hero, the steady, reassuring general with the enormous grin, the man who stood on the bridge of history and steered it in the right direction, who launched D-Day and won the war, and then became president and kept the peace. That version is true, as far as it goes. The problem is how far it goes, which is not very far at all. The second version, the one that dominated historical writing for 20 years after his death, is the grandfatherly sleepwalker. A comfortable, passive figure who played golf, while his subordinates ran the government, and history quietly happened around him. That version is not only incomplete, in crucial respects, it is flatly wrong. What the actual record shows, when you spend serious time with it, is something far more complicated and far more interesting than either version admits. It shows a man who was, by turns, infuriating and brilliant, cautious and audacious, politically sophisticated and personally honest in a way that those two qualities don't usually travel together. Let me tell you what kind of man we're actually dealing with. Dwight Eisenhower grew up in Abilene, Kansas, in a house with no money and no obvious future. His father worked in a creamery. His mother was a religious pacifist who believed, on principle, that war was morally wrong. The son she raised became the supreme commander of the largest military coalition in the history of Western civilization. A man who, on one particular June morning in 1944, had direct command authority over nearly 3 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen from more than a dozen nations. Think about the distance between those two facts. Think about what had to happen in between. Not just the career advancement, the promotions and postings, but the internal formation of a human being capable of bearing that specific weight. Because the weight was real, the decisions were real, the men who didn't come home were real. Eisenhower never once, in the entire documentary and private record, lost sight of that reality. That refusal to look away, that insistence on seeing the cost of what he was doing with clear eyes, is the thread that runs through this entire story. From the Kansas Creamery to the Normandy Bluffs, to the Oval Office, to the grave in Abilene where he is buried today. Here is what I find most remarkable about this story, and I've been researching it for a long time. The man was threatened with a court-martial early in his career for being right. He was told by the United States Army that if he continued to publish his views about the future of armored warfare, views that turned out to be correct in every essential particular, he would face formal military charges. He backed down on the publication. He did not back down on the thinking. He spent the next 20 years, quietly, patiently, building the intellectual and operational framework that he would eventually use to command the liberation of Western Europe. There's something in that patience that I think we consistently undervalue in our assessments of historical greatness. We like our great figures explosive. We like the drama of sudden revelation, the moment of genius that arrives like lightning. Eisenhower was not that kind of greatness. He was the other kind, the kind that is harder to see and, in the long run, harder to replicate. The kind that is built slowly, under pressure, over decades, by a man who kept doing the work, whether or not anyone was watching. And this is a story about failure as much as it is about success. I want to be clear about that from the start, because the popular biography of great men tends to airbrush the failures or relegate them to footnotes. In this documentary, they stay in the main text because the failures are where the character is most visible. The near disaster at Kasserine Pass in 1943, when American forces were pushed back in humiliating disarray by the Afrika Korps. The bloody, inconclusive campaign in the Hurtgen Forest, which consumed American divisions at a rate that still generates historical argument about whether it was necessary. The intelligence failure before the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944. The failure that allowed 250,000 German soldiers to launch a surprise attack that nearly split the Allied armies in half. The Market Garden catastrophe at Arnhem, where a bold plan encountered a reality that the planning hadn't adequately accounted for. These weren't someone else's failures. They happened under Eisenhower's command. He owned them. He learned from them. And then he kept going, because the alternative to keeping going was something he never once seriously entertained. There's a conversation I keep imagining, not inventing, just imagining, between Eisenhower and his mother, somewhere in the years before the war, when he was still a middle-ranking officer in a small, peacetime army, with no particular reason to believe he would ever command anything larger than a brigade. Ida Eisenhower had told her sons that war was wrong. Her son had chosen a military career anyway, and had spent his professional life thinking about how to fight wars effectively, and how to end them as quickly and decisively as possible. I wonder what she made of that. I wonder if he ever explained it to her in those terms, that the fastest way to end a war is to conduct it so precisely and so overwhelmingly that the other side runs out of reasons to continue. That restraint and overwhelming force are not opposites, but partners. That the man who plans the most careful, most thorough, most complete military operation is, paradoxically, the man who produces the least total suffering. Whether he ever said that to her, I can't know. What I do know is that every decision he made as Supreme Commander was consistent with it. This documentary is 15 chapters long. It will take you through the small Kansas town and the struggling creamery family, through the mixed academic record at West Point, and the slow, patient building of an extraordinary military mind. It will take you through the years under MacArthur. 7 years, working for one of the most difficult men in American military history, and the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941 that announced, to the people paying attention, that something exceptional was available. It will take you through North Africa and the education that failure provides, through the planning of Overlord and the extraordinary deception operations that made it survivable, through the Channel crossing and the beaches and the liberation of Paris and the shock of the Ardennes. It will take you to the Rhine and to the moment American soldiers found the concentration camps, and to the German surrender in a red brick schoolhouse in Reims at 2:23 in the morning of the 7th of May, 1945. And then, because this is where most documentaries stop and where this one keeps going, it will take you through the presidency, through the Cold War and Korea and McCarthyism and Little Rock and Sputnik and the U2 affair, all the way to the farewell address and its warning about the military-industrial complex that has only grown more urgent with every passing decade. I should tell you what this documentary is not going to do. It is not going to give you a sanitized, triumphalist account of an American hero. It is not going to ignore the covert operations in Iran and Guatemala that overthrew elected governments in the name of Cold War strategy, or the political cowardice of Eisenhower's silence on McCarthy when the silence had real human consequences, or the limitations of his instincts on civil rights, which were real limitations, even though his actions at Little Rock were real actions. It is not going to pretend that every decision he made was correct, because several of them weren't, and a documentary that doesn't acknowledge that isn't doing history. It's doing mythology. What it is going to do is give you the evidence and trust you to assess it yourself. That's the deal. You bring your attention, I'll bring the research. Between the two of us, we'll figure out what this man's life actually meant. One more thing before we begin. The title of this documentary is Supreme Commander, and I chose that title carefully. Not because the military command is the most important thing about Eisenhower. I'm not sure it is. But because it captures something essential about the specific quality his career asks us to examine. Supreme command is not the same thing as absolute command. A supreme commander in a coalition doesn't order people around. He persuades, manages, integrates, absorbs, and somehow makes it all add up to something coherent. He is the last person who has to hold the whole thing in his head simultaneously. Every national interest, every personality clash, every logistical constraint, every political pressure from every government involved. The margin between a coalition that functions and a coalition that fractures is, in most historical cases, one person. One person who can keep their head when everyone around them is protecting their own interests. Eisenhower was that person in the Second World War. Understanding how he became that person and what it cost him to be that person is what the next 15 chapters are about. If you've made it this far, you already know this is the kind of documentary you're going to want to watch properly. Not as background noise, not half watching while you scroll. Sit with it. Let the chapters run. The full story is 15 chapters, and each one builds on the one before it in ways that you'll only appreciate when you see where it ends up. So here is the call. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on the notifications. Share this with someone who cares about history. Not just military history, but the history of how human beings make consequential decisions under impossible conditions, which is the history that actually matters. Every chapter of this series will be released in full, with the same level of research and the same refusal to simplify what shouldn't be simplified. Because Dwight Eisenhower's story, the full story, not the abbreviated, mythology-flattened version, is one of the most important stories the 20th century produced. And it starts right now. Chapter 1. The boy from Abilene, Dwight David Eisenhower, was born on the 14th of October, 1890, in Denison, Texas, a railroad town, the kind of place where the wind came through the gaps in the walls and the future looked like whatever job was available at the end of the week. His father, David Eisenhower, was working as a mechanic in a creamery, a man of modest means and stubborn Protestant dignity, trying to support a family in circumstances that offered very little margin for error. Within a year or two, the family moved back to Abilene, Kansas, the small prairie town where Dwight would spend the next 2 decades of his life, and where, in many respects, the essential Eisenhower character was hammered into shape. Abilene in the 1890s was not a place that produced men who thought small. It sat on the old Chisholm Trail, the cattle route that had once made it one of the wildest towns on the plains. By the time Eisenhower was born, that wildness had been civilized away, but something of the self-sufficiency it demanded remained. You worked. You didn't complain much. You figured things out. These weren't values that Eisenhower ever explicitly articulated. They weren't the kind of thing you put in a speech, but they show up everywhere, in his later conduct, in his patience, in his refusal to dramatize, in his almost pathological preference for doing the actual work rather than being seen to do it. His mother, Ida, was a Mennonite and a religious pacifist who, by every account, opposed war on principle. I find this detail genuinely remarkable, and I think historians underplay it. Here is the woman who raised a man who would become supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, and she thought war was wrong. Full stop. What that meant for the household dynamics, we can only reconstruct, but it surely meant that Dwight grew up with the understanding that the world was complicated, that people could hold serious, sincere convictions that were in direct tension with one another, and that you had to navigate that tension without simply dismissing one side. That's not a bad preparation for coalition command. As a boy, Eisenhower loved football and military history in roughly equal measure. He read widely, accounts of campaigns, biographies of generals, the kind of reading that in a small Kansas town in 1905 probably made him seem odd to his peers and prescient to no one but himself. He was good with his hands, good at sports, and possessed of the kind of physical energy that in a different context might have looked like restlessness. What it actually was, I think, was ambition that hadn't found its channel yet. In high school, he excelled enough in athletics to attract some attention, but his family couldn't afford university. The solution, when it came to him in September of 1910, was almost accidental. He learned about a competitive entrance examination for the service academies, took it, scored second among 8 candidates, and only when the top-ranking candidate failed the physical, secured a place at West Point. I want to sit with that detail for a moment because it matters. Eisenhower didn't plan West Point as a young boy, dreaming of stars and salutes. He got in because the man ahead of him on a list had bad eyesight or a bad knee, or some other disqualifying condition. History turns on these small moments. If that other candidate had passed his physical, Eisenhower almost certainly goes somewhere else, does something else, and the largest Theban invasion ever attempted unfolds under a different hand, or doesn't unfold at all. That's not me being dramatic. That's just how thin the margin was. He entered West Point in June of 1911. His performance there was, by any generous reading, mixed. He played football until a knee injury ended that chapter. He smoked, played cards, and accumulated more demerits than the institution's instructors approved of. His grades were adequate, but far from distinguished. He graduated 61st out of a class of 164. His teachers concluded that he would probably make a good officer, but not a great one. In the long arc of military assessment errors, this ranks among the more spectacular. The class of 1915, by the way, would eventually produce more general officers than any other West Point class in history. It became known only in retrospect as the class the stars fell on. As a second lieutenant, Eisenhower's first assignment was Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, in June of 1915. It was, in the language of the era, a peacetime posting. The army was small, underfunded, and by international standards, extremely modest in its ambitions. For a young officer with genuine ability, it was the kind of assignment that could swallow years without producing any visible progress. Eisenhower threw himself into the work anyway, because that was what he did. But there's evidence in his personal correspondence that the frustration was real. He was watching the war in Europe from a distance, and he wanted in. And then he met Mamie Geneva Dowd. She was the daughter of a prosperous Denver family, wintering in San Antonio, as families of her social station tended to do. And by every account, she was vivid and funny, and precisely the kind of woman who does not wait patiently for a man to figure out what he wants. They married in 1916. Their first son, Dowd Dwight, died at the age of 3 from scarlet fever, a loss that, according to people who knew Eisenhower well in later life, never really left him. Their second son, John, survived and would eventually follow his father into the army. I mention this not for sentiment, but because the biographical record consistently shows that Eisenhower's private emotional life was far more layered than the public persona suggested. The grin was real, so was what lay behind it. The years between 1915 and 1939 are the years that biographers tend to compress into a few neat paragraphs of career advancement. That compression, I'd argue, is a mistake. These are the years in which Eisenhower's actual thinking was formed about logistics, about coalition warfare, about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power, about the absolute futility of sending men into situations the commanders hadn't properly understood. He didn't learn these things in a classroom, or not only in a classroom. He learned them slowly through assignments that looked unremarkable from the outside and were, on the inside, the construction of a mind that would eventually have to hold the Western alliance together under conditions of almost unbearable pressure. He also nearly derailed his career before it really began. In 1920, he and a young colonel named George S. Patton co-authored articles arguing that the army needed to stop thinking about tanks as infantry support weapons and start thinking about them as the central offensive instrument of modern warfare. The army's response was swift and unambiguous. Eisenhower was told that if he continued to publish ideas that contradicted official doctrine, he would face a court-martial. He was, in other words, threatened with career destruction for being correct. That he survived this episode, kept his career, kept his ideas, and eventually put those ideas into practice on a continental scale, is one of the more satisfying reversals in the entire record. Chapter 2, The Invisible Years. There's a stretch of Eisenhower's career that even dedicated students of the Second World War tend to skip past. It runs roughly from the early 1920s to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And on a surface read, it looks like a long, slow wait. But what it actually was a graduate education in the art of coalition and command that no formal school could have designed. The man who showed up in Washington in December of 1941, knowing exactly what needed to be done, didn't arrive at that knowledge by accident. He built it, piece by piece, over 2 decades of assignments that most of his contemporaries considered either tedious or unrewarding. The first major architect of Eisenhower's intellectual development was a general named Fox Connor. In 1922, Eisenhower was posted to the Panama Canal Zone, and Connor was his commanding officer. What Connor did over the next 2 years was, by any measure, extraordinary. He ran what Eisenhower later described as an informal graduate school in military history. He assigned reading Clausewitz, Napoleon's campaigns, the campaigns of the American Civil War, and then he discussed it with Eisenhower at length, pressing him on the why as much as the what. Connor also made what turned out to be a remarkably accurate prediction. He told Eisenhower that there would be another world war within 20 years, that it would be far more complex than the last, and that the United States would almost certainly need to fight it as part of a coalition. Coalition command, Connor argued, was the hardest kind of command there was. Eisenhower needed to understand it from first principles. I've read Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe, several times now. And what strikes me every time is how clearly you can trace the Fox-Connor sessions in the thinking that emerges on every page. The respect for logistics, the obsessive attention to what the other coalition partners actually need from the relationship, not just what they say they need. The refusal to allow personal friction, and there was plenty of it, to compromise operational effectiveness. These aren't instinctive behaviors, they're taught ones. And Connor taught them after Panama, and in no small part because of Connor's influence. Eisenhower was accepted to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He graduated first in his class of 245 officers in 1926. I want to be precise about that number because it matters. 245 officers, all of them selected, all of them competing for the top ranking, and Eisenhower finished first. This was not the record of a mediocre man waiting for his chance. This was a man who had learned, after the rocky start at West Point, how to focus his abilities with a precision that left no room for distraction. Something had changed in him in Panama. Connor had changed it. From Fort Leavenworth, the assignments kept coming. Service under General John J. Pershing at the American Battle Monuments Commission. Then back to the War Department. And then, in 1935, the assignment that would define the next chapter of his career. General Douglas MacArthur, then Army Chief of Staff, and about to take up a posting as the military advisor to the new Philippine Commonwealth, asked Eisenhower to come with him as his principal assistant. What followed was 7 years of working for one of the most difficult men in the history of the American military, and emerging from it with his professional reputation not only intact but quietly burnished. MacArthur and Eisenhower were by temperament almost perfectly mismatched. MacArthur was theatrical, egocentric, brilliant, and constitutionally incapable of sharing credit. Eisenhower was practical, systematic, and allergic to drama. MacArthur wanted men around him who reflected his own grandeur back at him. Eisenhower was useful to MacArthur because he was genuinely excellent at the work, but the relationship was almost continuously tense. MacArthur would later claim, memorably and somewhat absurdly, that Eisenhower had been the best clerk I ever had. Eisenhower's private response, recorded in his diary, was considerably less polite, but he stayed. He kept doing the work, because the work itself, building a military force for a new nation out of limited resources, under international pressure on an accelerated timeline, was exactly the kind of problem that sharpened the skills he was going to need. In the Philippines, Eisenhower was confronted with a logistics problem of significant complexity. How do you build an army from scratch when you don't have enough money, enough equipment, enough trained personnel, or enough time? The answer he and his team developed wasn't perfect. The Philippine military establishment that was in place when Japan attacked in December of 1941 had serious deficiencies. But the process of working through that problem taught Eisenhower something essential. He learned that the limiting factor in military operations is almost never courage. It's almost never tactics. It's almost always logistics, time, and industrial capacity. A commander who doesn't understand that distinction from his bones, not just from a textbook, will make decisions that look bold and are actually reckless. Eisenhower never made that mistake. Back in the United States by 1940, Eisenhower was by now a lieutenant colonel, a rank that, while respectable, was modest for a man in his late 40s, who had been working at the highest levels of American military planning for years. The army was small, underfunded, and still politically constrained by an American public that had no appetite whatsoever for European entanglement. But the war in Europe was already 2 years old. France had fallen. Britain was standing alone. And in army planning circles, the conversation was shifting rapidly from whether the United States would be drawn in to when and how. Eisenhower's opportunity to demonstrate what he was actually capable of came in September of 1941, roughly 3 months before Pearl Harbor, in the Louisiana Maneuvers, the largest peacetime military exercises in American history. More than 400,000 troops participated across 2 sides, the Blue Army and the Red Army. Eisenhower was serving as Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger's Third Army. The Blue Force and the planning and operational thinking he contributed was, by the consensus of the senior officers observing the exercise, decisive. The Third Army performed spectacularly. The after-action reports singled out Eisenhower repeatedly. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, was watching. he was always watching. The Louisiana maneuvers are one of those historical events that get a paragraph in most biographies and deserve a chapter. What they proved, in conditions as close to real warfare as peacetime permitted, was that the American army could be made to work at scale, but only if it had commanders who understood combined arms, who could coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery across a huge operational area, and who could do so without the entire exercise degenerating into the kind of bureaucratic chaos that had crippled so many military organizations before. Eisenhower could do all of that, Marshall noticed. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the call came. Report to Washington. The waiting, at last, was over. Chapter 3. Washington, Marshall, and the Weight of a Plan. The 7th of December, 1941, is a date that appears in virtually every account of the Second World War, and rightly so. But I want to draw your attention to what happened in the 6 days that followed it, because those 6 days tell you more about how the United States was actually going to fight the war than the attack itself does. On the 13th of December, General George C. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington and presented him with a question that must have felt, at that moment, like a riddle with no good answer. The Philippines were under Japanese attack. American forces there were isolated, outnumbered, and in serious danger of being overwhelmed. What should the United States do? Marshall wanted to know what Eisenhower thought. This was characteristic of Marshall. He believed in testing his officers by putting hard problems in front of them with minimal preparation and watching how they handled the pressure of not knowing. He gave Eisenhower a few hours to think it through. Eisenhower came back and told him, clearly, that the Philippines probably couldn't be held, that the distances involved, the Japanese control of the seas in the region, and the state of American naval capacity made a significant relief effort almost impossible in the near term. The honest answer was not a good answer, but it was the right one. Marshall looked at him, said something to the effect of, "I agree with you," and Eisenhower's career trajectory changed permanently in that moment. This is the Marshall-Eisenhower dynamic that I think gets underappreciated. It wasn't simply that Marshall recognized talent. Marshall was systematic about finding talent in a way that was itself unusual for the era. He kept notebooks. He observed officers under pressure. He had very little patience for men who performed brilliantly in normal circumstances and fell apart when the circumstances became impossible. Eisenhower didn't fall apart. He processed. He thought clearly under pressure, said what he actually believed rather than what was comfortable, and then got to work on whatever the conclusion demanded. To Marshall, this was worth more than any number of decorations or social credentials. By February of 1942, Eisenhower had been promoted to Chief of the War Plans Division with his second general's star. He was now one of the central architects of American strategic thinking at a moment when American strategic thinking was being built, essentially, from the ground up. The country had been at war for less than 3 months. The army was expanding at a rate that the logistical infrastructure could barely support. The Navy was reeling from Pearl Harbor, and somewhere in Washington, in a building that hadn't yet been fully completed, the Pentagon, then under construction, a relatively small group of planners was trying to figure out how and where a global war was going to be fought. The central strategic debate of the early war period, in both Washington and London, was a question that sounds simple but wasn't. Where do you fight Germany first? The American preference, strongly backed by both Marshall and Eisenhower, was for a direct cross-channel invasion of France as early as 1942. The idea was called Operation Sledgehammer, and the logic behind it was essentially this. Every month that the Western Allies delayed opening a major front in Western Europe was another month the Soviet Union bore the full weight of German military power alone. The Soviets were losing enormous numbers of soldiers. Stalin was demanding action, and Marshall, who understood better than almost anyone what the strategic consequences of a Soviet collapse would be, wanted a second front opened as quickly as possible. The British, led by Churchill, thought this was a catastrophic idea. And looking at it with historical hindsight, they weren't entirely wrong. The Allied forces available in 1942 were simply not yet capable of sustaining an invasion of France against the Wehrmacht at full strength. Churchill had been at war since 1939. He'd watched British forces defeated in France, in Greece, in North Africa. He was not about to sign off on an operation he believed would end in another Dunkirk. The argument between the American and British planners was real and sustained, and, on occasion, quite heated. Eisenhower was caught in the middle of it. As a key American advocate for the direct approach, while simultaneously beginning to understand that the British concerns weren't simply timidity. Operation Sledgehammer was cancelled. In its place came Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, scheduled for November of 1942. Eisenhower was given command. It was, on one level, a significant opportunity. On another level, it was an operation that many senior American officers privately thought was the wrong war in the wrong place. And Eisenhower knew that if it went badly, his career would effectively be over. He was not yet a proven battlefield commander. He had never led troops in combat. He was being asked to command a multinational force in a theater where the geography, the politics, and the enemy were all simultaneously unpredictable. What prepared him for this, perhaps more than any single factor, was the clarity of his understanding about what the role of Supreme Commander actually was. It wasn't, he believed, to personally direct the tactical engagements. It was to maintain the coalition, to keep the Americans and the British and, later, other allies working together toward a common goal. Despite their different national interests, different military cultures, different levels of experience, and different conceptions of how the war should be fought. This sounds obvious when you write it down. It is extraordinarily difficult to actually do, and it was Eisenhower's central professional contribution to the Allied victory. Not brilliance in the field, but the patient, grinding, day-by-day maintenance of an alliance under stress. In June of 1942, Marshall sent Eisenhower to England on a mission to assess the state of Anglo-American cooperation and lay the groundwork for combined operations. He arrived on the 24th of June, 1942. Within days, it was clear that the relationship between American and British officers was not at that point particularly functional. There were real cultural differences in how the two armies planned, communicated, and assessed risk. There were lingering resentments on both sides. British officers who thought the Americans were inexperienced and arrogant. American officers who thought the British were cautious to the point of paralysis. Eisenhower understood, with the precision of a man who had spent years thinking about exactly this problem, that none of those mutual resentments could be allowed to harden into operational dysfunction. In one of his early directives to American officers in England, he was blunt. Any officer heard making derogatory remarks about Allied counterparts would be sent home immediately. Not reprimanded, sent home. This wasn't diplomacy for its own sake. It was Eisenhower's understanding, formed from everything Fox Connor had told him 2 decades earlier, that coalition warfare is won or lost in the staff meetings and the planning sessions long before it's won or lost on the battlefield. You cannot coordinate an invasion across the English Channel if the people coordinating it are using their planning meetings to score points on national pride. Chapter 4. North Africa and the Education of a Commander. Operation Torch. The Allied invasion of North Africa launched in the early hours of the 8th of November 1942. It was, by the standards of what came later, a modest operation, roughly 100,000 Allied troops going ashore in 3 locations: Casablanca in Morocco, Oran in Algeria, and Algiers. But it was the first significant Allied offensive operation in the Western theatre. And virtually everything that could go wrong in the planning and execution of an amphibious assault did, in one form or another, go at least partially wrong. This is not a criticism of Eisenhower in isolation. It is an observation about the nature of military operations at scale, particularly when conducted for the first time by forces that have no collective operational experience. The French forces in North Africa, the Vichy French, nominally loyal to the collaborationist government in unoccupied France, were a wild card that Allied planners spent months trying to manage. Torch depended heavily on prior diplomatic arrangements with certain Vichy French officers who, it was hoped, would stand down rather than resist. Some of them did. Some of them fought back with a tenacity that briefly threatened several of the landings. The political dimension of the operation, negotiating with men who had been, technically, on the German side, was deeply uncomfortable for many in the Allied command. And Eisenhower was publicly criticized in some quarters for what was seen as accommodation of collaboration. He accepted the criticism, weathered it, and made clear that his priority was getting French North Africa into the Allied camp as quickly as possible, not satisfying the political sensibilities of observers who weren't responsible for the outcome. The German and Italian response in Tunisia was sharper and more effective than the Allied planners had anticipated. Rommel's Afrika Korps, even in its reduced state following the battles at El Alamein, was a formidable force led by experienced commanders. American forces, fighting in sustained combined arms operations for the first time, had a learning curve, and some of that learning was genuinely painful. The battle at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943 is the moment that historians of the North African campaign consistently return to. American forces were pushed back by a German attack that exploited weaknesses in command coordination and tactical inexperience. It was a setback, not a catastrophe, but it was serious enough to demand a response. Eisenhower's response to Kasserine is instructive. He didn't panic. He didn't assign blame indiscriminately. He identified what had failed. Specifically, the performance of the Second Corps commander, Lloyd Fredendall, who had been directing operations from a command post so far to the rear that he had, in the judgment of multiple senior officers, lost effective control of the battle. Eisenhower relieved him. He replaced him with a commander whose personality and temperament could not have been more different from his own: George S. Patton. This was, among other things, a remarkable piece of self-knowledge. Eisenhower understood that what the Second Corps needed in that moment was not systematic administration. It was shock. It was aggression. It was a man who would go forward, put himself in front of the troops, and rebuild their confidence with the sheer force of his presence. Patton was, by any measure, a difficult man. He was also exactly the right tool for that specific problem. There is a historiographical debate here that I think deserves mention rather than elision. Several historians, particularly those writing in the tradition of the British military historian Corelli Barnett, have argued that Eisenhower in North Africa was overly cautious, that the campaign took longer than it should have, and that the tutelage of British commanders like Harold Alexander was at times excessive. Others, particularly American scholars, push back on this reading and argue that the constraints Eisenhower was operating under, the political complexity, the supply lines, the raw inexperience of American forces, made the pace of the campaign entirely defensible. I don't think this debate has a clean resolution. What I do think is that Eisenhower's own assessment that North Africa was an education was exactly right, and that he emerged from it as a qualitatively different commander than the one who had arrived. The Tunisian campaign ended in May of 1943, with the surrender of roughly 250,000 Axis troops. This was, militarily and psychologically, a significant Allied victory, comparable in scale, if not in duration, to Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. The Afrika Korps ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The Mediterranean was effectively open to Allied shipping. The strategic consequences were real and substantial. But what I find more interesting than the strategic balance sheet is what the North African campaign did to Eisenhower personally. He had been tested, he had made mistakes, and corrected them. He had shown that he could maintain his nerve when operations went wrong, make hard personnel decisions without sentiment, and keep a multinational command coherent under genuine operational pressure. He had also been confronted, for the first time in his career, with the British concerns in action at the working level, not as an abstract problem to be theorized about, but as a daily reality to be navigated. The British were, taken as a group, more experienced than the Americans in 1942 and 1943. Their officers had been fighting since 1939. Their military culture placed enormous emphasis on caution and consolidation, on not exposing flanks, on ensuring that logistics were locked down before advancing. American military culture, at least in its self-conception, valued speed and audacity. Neither tradition was simply right or wrong. The challenge was integrating them, getting American dash and British consolidation to work together, rather than pull against each other. Eisenhower spent the rest of the war working on this problem. And the fact that he mostly succeeded is, I'd argue, his most underrated achievement. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, followed in July of 1943, and then the invasion of mainland Italy in September. These campaigns are often treated in popular histories as relatively minor affairs, mere preludes to the main event in Normandy. That framing is partially accurate and partially misleading. The Italian campaign was, from the start, extremely costly and extremely slow. The terrain of the Italian peninsula, mountain ranges running perpendicular to the axis of Allied advance, gave defenders an almost unfair advantage. The German commander in Italy, Albert Kesselring, was one of the most capable defensive commanders of the entire war, and he used that terrain with a skill that frustrated Allied advances for months at a time. Eisenhower was not primarily responsible for the Italian campaign. That responsibility shifted to other commanders. But his experience of Sicily and the initial Italian landings add further layers to his understanding of what combined operations required. The most important thing that happened to Eisenhower in the latter half of 1943 was not an operation at all. It was an appointment. At the Tehran Conference in November of 1943, the first meeting of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the question of who would command the cross-channel invasion was finally resolved. Stalin, with characteristic directness, insisted on knowing who it would be. Roosevelt, after considerable deliberation and against the expectation of many that it would be Marshall, named Eisenhower. The formal appointment came in December of 1943. Eisenhower was to be the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force for Operation Overlord. When the news reached him, Eisenhower reportedly said, "I just got word from the president." Nothing more grandiose than that. Whether this restraint was genuine or cultivated, it was consistent with everything in the record. The man was not given to heroic posturing about his own significance. He understood perfectly well what had just landed on his desk. And he understood it not in terms of honor, but in terms of work. There was a staggering amount of work to do, and approximately 6 months in which to do it. He flew to London in January of 1944. The clock was running. Chapter 5. Building the machine. Planning overlord. I want to tell you about a problem that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the popular histories of D-Day. The problem of the bombers. When Eisenhower arrived in London in January of 1944 and formally assumed command of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, one of the first things he ran into was a dispute about air power that nearly fractured the Allied command structure before a single soldier had left England. The Strategic Bombing Forces, the American 8th Air Force under General Jimmy Doolittle, and the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, did not, in their own conception of their mission, work for Eisenhower. They worked for their respective national commands, and both Doolittle and Harris had strongly held views about what strategic bombing should be doing that were not necessarily aligned with what Eisenhower needed it to do in the months before the invasion. Harris, in particular, believed that Bomber Command's mission was the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity and civilian infrastructure, a campaign that, in his view, would bring Germany to its knees without the need for a land invasion at all. He was not enthusiastic about diverting his heavy bombers to attack transportation infrastructure in France in preparation for Overlord. Eisenhower, who needed the French rail and road network disrupted so that German reinforcements couldn't reach Normandy rapidly once the landings began, had to fight for authority over these forces. The dispute went all the way to Churchill and ultimately to Roosevelt. Eisenhower made clear, without drama, but with absolute finality, that if he didn't have operational authority over the strategic air forces for the pre-invasion period, he couldn't guarantee the success of Overlord. He got it. Harris and Doolittle reported directly to him. The transportation plan, the Allied air campaign designed to destroy the French and Belgian rail networks, began in earnest in the spring of 1944. It was not without controversy of its own. French civilians living near railway yards and junction points were killed in the bombing, and de Gaulle's government in exile protested vigorously. Eisenhower and his planners acknowledged the cost. They concluded, after considerable deliberation, that the operational necessity outweighed the diplomatic damage. This is the kind of decision that looks clear in hindsight and was genuinely agonizing in the moment. The rail interdiction campaign was, by the time of the landings on the 6th of June, highly effective. The German ability to move reinforcements rapidly to Normandy was significantly degraded. The decision was right. It was also one that cost real lives to make. The Overlord plan itself, the actual mechanics of 5 naval assault divisions landing on 5 Normandy beaches, had been under development since the summer of 1943, when Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan and his planning team submitted their initial outline. When Eisenhower received the plan in January of 1944, his first and most consequential modification was to insist that it was too narrow. Morgan's original design called for 3 landing divisions. Eisenhower, supported by his ground commander, Bernard Montgomery, expanded it to 5, adding Utah Beach on the western flank to allow American forces to reach and cut the Cotentin Peninsula, thereby isolating and eventually capturing the port of Cherbourg, which the Allies desperately needed as a logistics hub. This expansion required more landing craft, and landing craft were one of the single most constraining resources in the entire Allied arsenal. The landing craft problem is one of those technical details that, once you understand it, changes your entire perception of the D-Day timeline. There were never enough of them. Every major Allied operation in the European and Pacific theatres was competing for the same limited production of LSTs, landing ship tanks, and LCTs, landing craft tanks. The date of the Normandy landings was constrained not by German defences or Allied readiness in any abstract sense, but by the physical availability of enough landing craft to put 5 divisions ashore simultaneously. The original target date of the 1st of May, 1944, was pushed back to June because the landing craft were not available. Every week's delay meant more time for the Germans to strengthen their coastal defenses. Every week's delay also meant more time for Allied training and supply accumulation. The tension between these competing pressures was constant and never entirely resolved. The deception operation, Operation Bodyguard, and within it, the specific sub-operation known as Fortitude, was perhaps the most elaborate strategic deception in the history of warfare. The object was to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would come not at Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, where German forces could be most quickly reinforced. An entire fictional army group was constructed for this purpose. The 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by Patton, fake radio traffic, double agents, dummy equipment, carefully managed leaks through neutral countries. The scale of the deception effort was extraordinary, and it worked. On the 6th of June, and for weeks afterwards, significant German armoured reserves were held back from Normandy in anticipation of a second, larger landing near Calais that was never going to come. Eisenhower's role in all of this was not tactical. He wasn't designing the deception plans in detail or personally coordinating the air interdiction campaign at the targeting level. His role was integration, making sure that all of these separate strands of effort, managed by different commands with different national loyalties and different institutional priorities, were actually pulling in the same direction at the same time. This sounds managerial, and in a sense it was. But management at this scale, with these stakes, under these pressures, is a form of genius. The failure mode, the thing that would have wrecked Overlord before it launched, wasn't an intelligence failure, or a logistics failure, or a tactical failure. It was an integration failure, a breakdown in the coordination between the dozens of planning efforts that had to fit together precisely on the morning of the 6th of June. That breakdown didn't happen. It's easy to not notice the things that don't happen. By May of 1944, nearly 3 million Allied personnel were assembled in Britain. The build-up, codenamed Operation Bolero, had been running since 1942, and the scale of it was genuinely staggering. Men, vehicles, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, bridging equipment, the entire material infrastructure of a continental military campaign, packed into a relatively small island. The ports of southern England were by this point operating at absolute capacity. The roads were clogged, the airfields were full, the training areas were full. Britain in the spring of 1944 was a coiled spring, and the question of exactly when to release it was one that only one man could answer. The selection of the invasion date was constrained by 3 requirements that could only be satisfied simultaneously on a handful of days each month. A full moon for the airborne forces to navigate by, specific tidal conditions for the infantry landing craft to clear the beach obstacles, and a period of at least moderate weather for the naval and air support to operate effectively. The tidal conditions narrowed the window to roughly 6 days around the new or full moon each month. The weather introduced a variable that no amount of planning could fully control. Eisenhower's meteorological team, led by a Scottish group captain named James Stagg, was providing forecasts that stretched the limits of what 1944 meteorological science could reliably deliver. The window in early June appeared to offer a narrow period of acceptable weather between 2 storms. Stagg's briefings in the days leading up to the decision were among the most consequential weather reports in history, and by Stagg's own account in his subsequent memoir, the uncertainty in them was very real. Eisenhower had begun the process of issuing preliminary orders for the invasion on the 3rd of June. targeting the morning of the 5th of June for the landings. On the evening of the 4th, with troops already loaded onto ships and some convoys already at sea, Stagg's forecast showed the weather deteriorating sharply. Eisenhower called a meeting. His senior commanders were present. The debate was real and sustained. The logistical cost of standing down and rescheduling, the fuel, the physical difficulty of reversing loaded convoys, the security implications of troops who had been briefed being put back ashore, was enormous. The cost of going on the 5th of June into a channel storm with inadequate naval gunfire support and compromised air cover could be catastrophic. Eisenhower postponed. He sent the order out in the small hours of the 4th of June and then went, as was his habit under stress, to play a brief game of checkers. Chapter 6. The 5th of June. The longest decision. Let me tell you about a piece of paper that sat in Eisenhower's wallet for several weeks and was never meant to be read by anyone. It was written in pencil on a small sheet of notepaper sometime in the late afternoon of the 5th of June, 1944. The troops were already embarked. The decision to go, issued in the early hours of that morning after Stagg's revised forecast showed a narrow window of improved weather, had already been made. The armada of more than 7,000 naval vessels was moving across the channel, and Eisenhower, sitting somewhere in his command trailer in the English countryside, wrote a message accepting full responsibility for the decision to launch the invasion. If it failed, he wrote, the fault was entirely his. The troops had done everything that could be asked of human beings, and the failure rested on his judgment alone. He dated it the 5th of July, a mistake almost certainly born of stress and exhaustion, since he was writing it on the 5th of June. He folded it, put it in his pocket, and said nothing about it to anyone. It was found later by an aide, and it is now held in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. I've seen photographs of it, and what strikes me every time is the handwriting. It isn't trembling. It isn't neat either. It was dashed off quickly, clearly, but it's controlled. The man who wrote it had made his decision and was at peace with it, or at least as close to peace as the circumstances allowed. He wasn't performing stoicism, he was expressing it. The decision to proceed on the 6th of June was taken in the early hours of the 5th, in a meeting at Southwick House near Portsmouth. Stagg had just delivered a revised forecast, showing a period of acceptable, if not ideal, weather opening on the morning of the 6th and lasting perhaps 36 hours before conditions deteriorated again. The ceiling would be too low for the heavy bombers to operate effectively. The seas would be rough enough to make the infantry's crossing deeply unpleasant and the landing approaches genuinely hazardous. But it was the best window available, and the next comparable window wouldn't come until around the 19th of June, a delay of 2 weeks, with all the security and logistical consequences that entailed. Eisenhower went around the room. His commanders gave their views. Montgomery said go. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding the naval forces, said the Navy could do it. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory was more hesitant. He was worried about the bomber support. Eisenhower listened. He sat quietly for what witnesses described as roughly 30 seconds. Then he said, in words that have been slightly differently rendered in different accounts, but whose substance is consistent. Okay, let's go. That was it. The largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare began with a quiet sentence in a room full of tired men. What happened next? The airborne drops, the naval bombardment, the assault waves hitting the beaches in the grey half-light of the 6th of June, is documented in extraordinary detail in the historical record. And I want to be careful here not to compress it into easy narrative. The airborne operations were less precise than the plans had intended. Many paratroopers of the American 82nd and 100 and 1st Airborne Divisions came down miles from their intended drop zones. Some landed in flooded areas and drowned. Some landed isolated, deep in enemy territory, without their equipment. And yet, and this is one of the genuinely remarkable aspects of the operation, the scattered drops actually contributed to the confusion of the German response. The Germans couldn't figure out where the main effort was. The chaos that should have been a tactical disaster became, in a specific and unintended way, a deception. The beaches tell 5 different stories, and I want to be precise about this because the standard popular narrative tends to collapse them into a single arc. Utah Beach, on the western flank, went almost textbook well. The landing craft were nudged south of their intended position by currents, and the deflection actually put them onto a more lightly defended section of the beach. American casualties at Utah were, relatively speaking, light. Omaha Beach, in the center of the American sector, was the one that came closest to failure. The terrain was less forgiving. The German defenses were more intact. The pre-landing air bombardment had overshot, dropping most of its bombs inland, and the assault units, particularly the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division, took catastrophic losses in the first hours. At various points during the morning, the situation at Omaha was close enough to collapse that there were genuine discussions in the command chain about whether to halt the follow-on landings. The British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, had their own specific challenges. Flooded causeways, determined German resistance in fortified villages, coordination difficulties between the armoured assault vehicles and the infantry following them ashore, the British specialised armoured vehicles, the funnies developed by General Percy Hobart, including flail tanks for clearing mines and armoured bulldozers, proved their worth. The American sector, where the offer of these vehicles had been declined, felt their absence at Omaha. This is one of those details that sits in the footnotes of most histories, but deserves more prominence. The single greatest predictor of which beaches had manageable casualties on the 6th of June was whether the armoured engineer vehicles were present in the initial waves. By the end of the 6th of June, roughly 156,000 Allied troops had been landed in Normandy. The beachhead was established. It was precarious in places, not yet linked up, and under continuous pressure from German forces that were, despite the deception campaign, beginning to react. But it existed. Eisenhower had done the thing that Fox Connor had told him 2 decades earlier in Panama was the hardest thing in coalition warfare. He had held it together. The Americans, the British, the Canadians, the various free forces of the occupied nations. They had gone ashore on the same morning, on the same tide, under a single command authority, and they had not broken. Eisenhower spent the 6th of June at his headquarters, receiving reports. He did not cross the channel himself. He visited the airborne units the evening before the launch. A visit that, by multiple accounts, was one of the more affecting moments of the entire war. He walked among the troops of the 101st Airborne as they prepared to board their aircraft, talking to them individually, asking where they were from, what they did before the war. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, wrote later that when the cars pulled away and the general's face was turned away from the assembled men, Eisenhower's eyes were wet. I don't think this detail needs embellishment. A man who had just sent more than 13,000 paratroopers into the dark, knowing the casualty estimates, knowing that some of the men he'd just spoken to would not come back. That's not a man who was handling weight lightly. That's a man who was handling it honestly. The message he had sent to the troops on the morning of the invasion. The order of the day, issued on the 6th of June, 1944, began with these words: "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. It's the document in the National Archives. It was read to units across the force. It ends with a sentence about the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe. The language is formal, even a little stiff by modern standards. But there's nothing hollow in it. He believed every word. The man was not capable of hollow. And that, more than any tactical decision he ever made, is why the men who served under him trusted him. Chapter 7. The Breakout. Cobra, Patton, and the Race Across France. The Normandy beachhead in late June and early July of 1944 was not the triumphant liberation story that the popular imagination tends to produce. It was a grinding, miserable, bloody stalemate conducted in some of the most tactically unfavorable terrain in Western Europe. The Norman bocage, the ancient network of earthen hedgerows, some of them centuries old, rooted deep and rising to the height of a man's head, turned every field into a fortress and every lane into a potential ambush. Tanks that had been designed to exploit open ground were nearly useless in conditions where a German machine gun crew could hold a single field boundary against an entire company of infantry. The soldiers who fought through the bocage in June and July of 1944 were doing something that no amount of training in England had adequately prepared them for, because nobody had adequately anticipated it. That's not a failure of imaginations, so much as a reminder that modern warfare consistently produces conditions that defy pre-battle rehearsal. Eisenhower was under pressure from every direction during this period. The press, particularly in the United States, had expected rapid exploitation after the landings. The public consciousness, shaped by the drama of D-Day itself, was struggling to understand why Allied forces, 6 weeks after the greatest amphibious operation in history, were still essentially confined to a beachhead 30 to 40 kilometers deep. Churchill was worried. Marshall was watching, and on the ground, the situation was more complex than any of them fully appreciated from their respective remove. Bernard Montgomery, commanding the Allied ground forces, had a plan that called for British and Canadian forces around Caen to act as a hinge, drawing German armor onto themselves, while American forces on the right prepared a breakout. The plan was operationally coherent. Its communication to the press and to the Allied political leadership was, to put it diplomatically, poor. Montgomery gave the impression repeatedly that Caen was about to fall when it wasn't, and each delay eroded confidence in both his judgment and Eisenhower's management of him. I want to be honest about the Montgomery question because it's one of the genuinely contested areas in the historiography of the Northwest Europe campaign, and papering over it would be intellectually dishonest. The debate, roughly summarized, is this. Was Montgomery a master strategist whose broad front concept was essentially sound but poorly understood by American critics? Or was he an overcautious commander whose reluctance to exploit successes cost the Allies months and tens of thousands of casualties? The honest answer is that both things are probably partially true, and the truth varies by specific operation. What is not debatable is that Eisenhower's management of Montgomery, keeping him in command despite sustained American frustration, maintaining the coalition's public cohesion while privately pressing for more aggressive action, was a political and personal achievement of considerable difficulty. The two men's relationship was one of the most professionally strained in the entire Allied command, and yet it never quite broke. Operation Cobra, the American breakout operation, was scheduled to begin on the 24th of July, 1944, in the sector around St. Lo. The concept was straightforward. Concentrate the Allied heavy bombers over a narrow corridor, saturate the German defenses with an unprecedented weight of explosives, and then push armored columns through the gap before the defenders could recover. The execution was less straightforward. On the first day of bombing, short drops killed and wounded American soldiers waiting in their start positions. A disaster that was in part a consequence of the proximity of the bomb line to the forward troops, and in part a consequence of the difficulties of precision bombing with the technology of 1944. General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, died in one of these short drops. The bombing was repeated on the 25th of July, again with short drops and further friendly casualties. But the weight of explosives delivered on the German positions was massive enough to shatter the defending formations. The Panzer Division, one of the best German armoured divisions in Normandy, was, by its own commander's accounts, effectively destroyed as a coherent fighting force within hours. George Patton's Third Army was activated on the 1st of August, 1944, and within days it was moving in a way that the Normandy campaign had not yet seen. Patton drove his columns hard, through Avalanches into Brittany, and then, in the decision that most military historians identify as the operationally decisive choice of the entire Normandy campaign, pivoting east toward the Seine rather than west into Brittany to reduce the port fortresses. The pivot wasn't entirely Patton's idea. It emerged from the planning process at Shaef, but Patton executed it with a speed and aggression that the situation demanded and that very few commanders could have matched. By mid-August, the German Army Group B was in serious danger of encirclement in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, a trap formed by American forces swinging north and Canadian forces pressing south, with the potential to destroy two entire German field armies if the jaws closed completely. The closing of the Falaise Pocket is one of those moments in military history where the distance between what actually happened and what might have happened is agonizing to contemplate. The pocket was never fully sealed. Between perhaps 40,000 and 50,000 German soldiers escaped through the gap near Falaise and Trun before it closed, carrying with them enough experienced officers and NCOs to form the nucleus of the forces that would defend the Siegfried Line and eventually launch the Ardennes offensive in December. The failure to close the pocket completely has been blamed variously on Montgomery, on the Canadian forces whose advance was slower than planned, on the Americans who halted at the boundary line established by the Army Group boundary rather than pushing through it, and on Eisenhower himself for not intervening to override the boundary. The historiography here is genuinely tangled, and I don't think it has a clean verdict. What is clear is that the escape of those experienced German formations had consequences that were felt all the way through to the spring of 1945. The liberation of Paris in late August of 1944 was, in a narrow military sense, not supposed to happen when it did. Eisenhower's original plan called for bypassing Paris. The city was estimated to require 4,000 tons of supplies per day to feed its population, supplies that the overstretched Allied logistics system couldn't spare at that moment. From a purely military logistics perspective, taking Paris early was a drain that the campaign didn't need. But the French internal resistance rose up in the city on the 19th of August, and General Charles de Gaulle, with characteristic forcefulness, made clear that French national honour required French forces to liberate the French capital. He was not asking. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armoured Division was given the lead. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August 1944, and the images of that liberation are among the most famous of the entire war. Eisenhower's decision to accede to the liberation of Paris, against his logistics officer's recommendations, is one of several places in the record where you see him making a judgment that isn't purely military. He understood, as Marshall had understood, and as Churchill had understood, that the war was being fought not just on the map, but in the minds of nations. A France that liberated its own capital under its own flag, with French soldiers leading the column down the Champs-Élysées. That France was going to be a different post-war partner than a France that had stood aside while Anglo-American forces occupied its capital. The logistics cost was real. The political benefit was also real. He made the call. By September of 1944, the strategic situation looked, from a certain altitude, almost impossibly good. German forces in France had been shattered. The Falaise survivors were streaming back toward the German border in disorder. Belgium had been liberated. Brussels fell on the 3rd of September and Antwerp on the 4th. The mood at Schaeff was, briefly, optimistic, almost to the point of overconfidence. There were genuine estimates from some quarters that Germany might collapse before the end of 1944. Eisenhower, characteristically, was more cautious. He had watched German armies recover from near disaster before. He knew that the Wehrmacht, even in retreat, was not the same thing as a defeated army, and he was deeply, continuously worried about something that the press coverage of the liberation summer almost entirely ignored. The Allied supply lines were stretched to the absolute limit and beyond it. The Red Ball Express, the emergency trucking operation established in late August to haul supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing armies, was moving roughly 12,000 tons of supplies per day at its peak. It was an improvised logistical solution of genuine brilliance, driven largely by African-American truck companies, whose contribution to Allied logistics has historically received less recognition than it deserved. But even the Red Ball Express wasn't enough. The armies were advancing faster than the supply system could follow, and by early September, Patton's Third Army was running on fumes, sometimes literally, as tank units ran out of fuel and had to halt in place. The Great Allied advance was beginning to outrun its own ability to sustain itself, and the consequences of that overextension would arrive with full force in the autumn. Chapter 8: The Broad Front, Market Garden, and the Limits of Optimism. The strategic debate that consumed Schaeff in the late summer and early autumn of 1944 is one of the most argued over questions in the entire history of the Second World War, and I want to engage with it honestly rather than simply endorsing one side. The question was this: with German forces in France, shattered and apparently in full retreat, should the Allies concentrate their resources on a single powerful thrust into Germany, a narrow front strategy, or should they advance on a broad front, maintaining pressure across the entire line while they sorted out the supply crisis? Montgomery argued, with characteristic intensity, for the narrow front. He wanted the resources, the fuel, the ammunition, the transportation, concentrated behind a single powerful thrust into northern Germany, aimed at the Ruhr industrial region. He believed this thrust could end the war in 1944. Patton, with roughly equal intensity, but from the opposite geographic direction, argued for the same concentration of resources behind his army, going through the Saar. Eisenhower chose the broad front. This decision has been criticized ever since, most thoroughly by British historians writing in the Montgomery tradition, who argue that the concentration of resources behind a single thrust would have ended the war months earlier, saving tens of thousands of Allied casualties, and, potentially, the lives of the hundreds of thousands of Jews and other victims who died in the German concentration camps in the autumn and winter of 1944 and 45. This is a genuinely serious argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. The counter-argument made by American historians and supported by some German post-war analysis is that the logistics situation in September of 1944 was not capable of sustaining a single narrow thrust of the size and duration that Montgomery was proposing, and that a concentrated drive by 40 divisions into Germany would have outrun its supply lines and stalled in the Ruhr. leaving the other Allied armies paralyzed at the German border. I lean toward the logistical counter-argument, but I want to be clear that this is a genuinely contested question that professional historians haven't resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What Eisenhower did authorize in September of 1944 was Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in history, designed to drop 3.5 Allied airborne divisions along a corridor in the Netherlands, seize a series of bridges over the major water obstacles between the Belgian border and the Rhine, and allow the British Second Army to advance rapidly north and then east into Germany, bypassing the northern end of the Siegfried Line. The concept was bold. Some would say the word is reckless, and it represented the most aggressive single operation Eisenhower authorized in the Northwest Europe campaign. It was, in its origins, Montgomery's idea, and the fact that Eisenhower approved it has sometimes been used as evidence that the broad front versus narrow front debate is oversimplified. Eisenhower could authorize bold operations when the situation seemed to demand them. He gave Market Garden the resources it needed, or rather, the resources he could spare, which turned out not to be quite enough. Market Garden launched on the 17th of September, 1944. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed and secured their objectives at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, with generally acceptable results, though not without significant fighting and delay. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped at Arnhem, the furthest north of the bridge objectives, and immediately ran into serious trouble. The intelligence before the operation had indicated that German armoured forces in the Arnhem area were limited. That intelligence was wrong. 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were in the area, refitting after the battles in France. The 1st Airborne landed almost on top of them. The radios didn't work properly. The planned link-up with the ground forces was delayed by German resistance along the corridor. The paratroopers holding the north end of the Arnhem Bridge, a relatively small force under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, held on for 4 days against overwhelming odds, which was 2 or 3 days longer than anyone had a right to expect. But it wasn't enough. The ground forces couldn't get through in time. The failure at Arnhem has understandably generated an enormous historical literature. The intelligence failure regarding the SS Panzer divisions, the decision to drop the 1st Airborne too far from its objectives, the radio frequency problems, the delays on the ground corridor. Each of these factors has been identified, at one time or another, as the reason Market Garden failed, and each of them is partially correct and insufficient on its own. What I think the evidence actually shows is that Market Garden was a plan that required everything to go right in an environment. A narrow road corridor through occupied Netherlands in September that was structurally likely to produce delays and disruptions. The margin between success and failure was too thin. When several things went wrong simultaneously, as they did, the operation collapsed. Eisenhower acknowledged, years later, that the risk had been higher than he'd assessed at the time. This was not a man who habitually deflected responsibility. The failure of Market Garden had strategic consequences beyond the loss of 1 airborne division. It confirmed that the war would not end in 1944. The Siegfried Line was intact. The Rhine had not been crossed. German forces that had been retreating in disorder were now behind their own border fortifications, re-equipped, reorganized to a significant degree, and fighting with the particular ferocity of men defending their homeland. The Allied supply crisis, which Market Garden had been partly designed to bypass, was still unresolved. The port of Antwerp, captured on the 4th of September, was still unusable because the Germans held the Scheldt estuary, the waterway connecting Antwerp to the sea, and would continue to hold it until late November. The failure to capture the Scheldt approaches immediately after taking Antwerp was, in the judgment of many historians, one of the significant operational errors of the Northwest Europe campaign, and the responsibility for it sits in the British Second Army's area of operations. The autumn and early winter of 1944 were, at the senior command level, a period of sustained strain. The Americans, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, were increasingly frustrated with what they saw as British caution and British dominance of the strategic narrative. The British, Montgomery, Brooke, Churchill, were increasingly concerned that American strategic direction was incoherent and that the broad front approach was squandering opportunities. These tensions were never secret, exactly, but they were managed carefully enough to keep the alliance functional. Eisenhower's letters from this period show a man under real personal stress, not the theatrical stress of a general performing leadership, but the quieter, heavier stress of someone who is aware that the decisions he is making in a heated room in England will determine the course of a war and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. He mentions his sleep. He mentions his blood pressure. He mentions, occasionally, his desire to be back in Kansas. There were real command changes that Eisenhower had to navigate in this period. The pressure from Washington and from the press for more visible American command presence was becoming intense. In September of 1944, Eisenhower himself took over direct command of the ground forces from Montgomery, a change that Montgomery received as a demotion, and that generated a sustained, bitter campaign by Montgomery's admirers and by the Field Marshal himself to have it reversed. Eisenhower held firm. Montgomery retained command of 21st Army Group, but no longer had authority over American ground forces. Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, reported directly to Eisenhower. The arrangement was sensible from an American political perspective and defensible from a military one. It was also from the perspective of operational coherence on the northern flank, slightly more complicated than the alternative. Eisenhower accepted the complications. By December of 1944, the front was essentially static. The Allied armies were pressed up against or through the Siegfried Line in several places. But the breakthroughs hadn't come. The Hurtgen Forest, south of Aachen, was consuming American divisions at a rate that alarmed Scheiff's planners. The forest fighting was at least as brutal and tactically attritional as the Bocage had been, with no equivalent of the Cobra breakout visible on the horizon. The casualty replacement crisis was becoming acute. The American army was running short of trained infantry replacements, a problem that had been building since the campaign began, but was now arriving with full force. Patton's Third Army was pressing into the Saar but hadn't broken through. The war was not over. And then, on the 16th of December, the Germans proved that they hadn't read the optimistic Scheiff assessments from September. Chapter 9. The Ardennes. Crisis, Command, and Character. On the morning of the 16th of December, 1944, roughly 250,000 German soldiers, supported by approximately 600 armoured vehicles, launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack fell on a section of the Allied line that was held by relatively few American divisions, some of them newly arrived, some of them recovering from combat in the Hurtgen forest. The choice of the Ardennes was deliberate. Hitler's planners had correctly identified it as the weakest point in the Allied line, and they had also correctly identified that the Allies were not expecting a major offensive there, partly because the terrain was so difficult, and partly because the Allied intelligence picture, distorted by overconfidence after the summer's victories, had consistently underestimated German capacity for offensive action in the autumn of 1944. The initial German penetration was deeper and faster than anything the Allies had experienced, since the crisis of the Kasserine Pass nearly 2 years earlier. The intelligence failure before the Ardennes offensive is a topic that deserves more careful handling than it typically receives. The Ultra Signals Intelligence Program, the Allied ability to read German encrypted communications, had been a significant advantage throughout the war. But in the weeks before the Ardennes attack, German radio silence and the use of landlines for the most sensitive operational communications significantly reduced the ultra take. There were other indicators: increased rail traffic to the west, prisoner reports of new armor concentrations that were noted in various intelligence summaries, but didn't coalesce into a clear picture of an imminent offensive. The tendency in intelligence analysis to see what the overall strategic picture suggests you should see. Confirmation bias, in modern terms, played a role. Nobody at SHAEF expected a German offensive in December of 1944, because the prevailing assessment was that Germany didn't have the resources for one. The assessment was wrong. Germany had been husbanding resources for months in preparation for precisely this effort. Eisenhower's response to the Ardennes attack is, in my view, the finest display of operational judgment in his entire wartime career. On the first day of the offensive, when the scale of the penetration was still unclear, and the natural response of headquarters staff was to wait for more information, Eisenhower called a meeting and identified 2 armored divisions, the 7th and 10th, that could move to the shoulders of the penetration immediately. He ordered them to move. This sounds straightforward. It wasn't. The information picture was fragmentary. The scale of the German attack was unknown, and moving armored reserves before you know where the main effort is carries real risk of misplacing your response. Eisenhower placed his bet that the Ardennes was the main effort and not a feint. He was right. 2 decisions in the following days illustrate Eisenhower's qualities under pressure with particular clarity. The first was the dispatch of the 82nd and 100 and 1st Airborne Divisions to the critical road junction at Bastogne. The 101st, under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, arrived just in time to hold the town against German armored forces that surrounded it completely by the 20th of December. Bastogne was a critical hub. 8 major roads converged on it, and its loss would have significantly eased the German advance. The decision to send the airborne there, made under time pressure and without complete information, was correct. The 101st held. McAuliffe's response to a German surrender demand, a single word, nuts, became one of the more celebrated pieces of military correspondence of the war, and its bravado was entirely real. The garrison was surrounded, running short of supplies, and taking casualties continuously, but they held. The second decision was more controversial. On the 20th of December, with American forces in the north of the German penetration temporarily cut off from Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg by the German advance, Eisenhower transferred command of those forces, including the 1st and 9th Armies, to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The operational logic was clear. It was physically difficult for Bradley to command forces on both sides of the Bulge from Luxembourg while his communications were disrupted. Montgomery was geographically better positioned to coordinate the northern shoulder, but the decision created a firestorm in American command circles. Bradley was furious. Patton was furious. The American press, when they found out, was furious. Montgomery's subsequent handling of the situation, including a press conference on the 7th of January, 1945, in which he gave the impression that he had personally rescued the American army, was, by general consensus, including the consensus of his own biographers, a significant error of judgment that very nearly caused the worst political crisis in the history of the Anglo-American alliance. I need to stop here and be precise about what actually happened at that press conference. Because the historical record is important. Montgomery did not say, in so many words, that he had saved the American army. He did give an account of the battle that placed himself at the center of it in a way that grated badly on American ears. He did describe British troops fighting on the northern flank in terms that implied they had done the heavy work. Omar Bradley, reading the press reports, was so angry that he drafted a cable to Marshall, offering his resignation if Eisenhower didn't reassert American command. Eisenhower sent Montgomery a private message making clear, in terms that were unambiguous, even by his understated standards, that the press conference had caused serious damage. Montgomery sent a conciliatory reply and backed down. The crisis passed, just. The underlying tension did not pass. It remained a fault line in the alliance for the rest of the war. The German offensive in the Ardennes was essentially contained by the end of December, and from the first days of January of 1945, Patton's Third Army, which had made one of the most remarkable command reversals in the war, wheeling 90 degrees from facing east to attacking north in a matter of days, was pressing hard into the southern flank of the salient. The relief of Bastogne on the 26th of December is one of those moments that the historical record and the popular memory are largely in agreement about. It was an extraordinary operational achievement. Patton had promised Eisenhower that he could get to Bastogne in 48 hours. He took slightly longer, but the combination of speed and aggression that the operation required was exactly what the situation demanded, and Patton delivered it. By the end of January of 1945, the Ardennes salient had been reduced. The Allied line was approximately where it had been before the German attack. The Wehrmacht had used the best reserves it had left in the West. Those reserves were gone. The Luftwaffe had committed its aircraft in numbers it couldn't replace. The German industrial base, already strained, had been stripped to equip the offensive. Germany had bet everything on a single throw designed to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement, and had failed. From a strategic perspective, the Battle of the Bulge, for all its cost to the Allies in casualties, shortened the war by consuming German resources that could otherwise have been used to slow the Allied advance to the Rhine. That's a counterintuitive reading, but it's one that the evidence supports. What the Ardennes crisis revealed about Eisenhower personally was something that his critics, who tended to portray him as an administrator rather than a commander, needed to reckon with. Under genuine, sudden, large-scale crisis, with fragmentary information, under political pressure from multiple directions, he had made the right decisions fast. The reserves went to the right places. The airborne secured Bastogne. The Northern Command was reorganized in a way that was logistically sensible, even if it was politically painful. He had not panicked, not vacillated, not retreated into bureaucratic process. He had commanded. The crisis wasn't proof of greatness in the dramatic sense. It was proof of something quieter, and in many ways more valuable. Reliability under pressure, judgment under uncertainty, and the willingness to make hard calls without waiting for the situation to become clear. Because in a crisis, the situation never becomes clear before the call has to be made. Chapter 10, Crossing the Rhine, the beginning of the end. The crossing of the Rhine was, in the symbolic and practical geography of the Second World War's European theatre, the moment when the outcome stopped being a question of whether and became a question of when. The Rhine was more than a river. It was the historical boundary of Germany, the western frontier of the German nation, for more than 1,000 years. The line that German propaganda had promised would be held against all comers. For Eisenhower's armies, reaching it was the culmination of 9 months of fighting from Normandy. For the German soldiers and civilians on the far bank, it was the end of the illusion that the war could end in anything other than unconditional Allied occupation of German soil. Eisenhower's crossing plan for early 1945 called for clearing the west bank of the Rhine entirely before attempting a crossing, a deliberate, methodical approach that drew criticism from Patton and others who wanted to push a crossing as soon as the opportunity arose. The logic was sound. A premature crossing without adequate resources on the far bank, with German forces still capable of counterattacking on the west bank, risked creating an isolated bridgehead that the Germans could destroy at their convenience. Eisenhower wanted the entire west bank cleared, German forces on that side either destroyed or driven back, and then a set-piece crossing with overwhelming force. Operation Veritable, the Canadian and British attack in the north designed to clear the Reichswald forest, and Operation Grenade, the American Ninth Army attack to its south, were the instruments for clearing the West Bank in the northern sector. They launched in February of 1945 and succeeded at considerable cost in the flooded, difficult terrain. On the 7th of March 1945, something happened that nobody, not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not the planners at SHAEF, and certainly not the German High Command, had expected. Soldiers of the 9th Armored Division of the First Army, pushing forward to the Rhine Bridge at Remagen, found it intact. The Germans had prepared it for demolition, but the demolition had not succeeded. The charges had fired, but hadn't dropped the bridge. Sergeant Alexander Drabick became the first American soldier to cross the Rhine when his squad ran across the still-standing Ludendorff Bridge at roughly 1600 hours on the 7th of March. Bradley, when he heard the news, called Eisenhower immediately. By Eisenhower's own account, it was one of the few moments during the campaign when he felt unconditional joy. He told Bradley to put every man he could across that bridge. The Remagen bridgehead didn't become the main Allied crossing point. The bridge itself collapsed 10 days later from structural damage, though by then enough engineers had built pontoon bridges alongside it that the loss didn't matter operationally. But the strategic and psychological significance of Remagen was enormous. It proved that the Rhine could be crossed. It pulled German reserves south to contain the bridgehead, away from the carefully planned main crossing in the north. And it did something less tangible but equally important. It confirmed for everyone on the Allied side, from Eisenhower down to the newest replacement private, that the war had entered its final phase. The Rhine had been breached. The road to Berlin was open. Patton crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, in the early hours of the 23rd of March, quietly, with minimal fanfare, deliberately timed to get across before Montgomery's massive set-piece crossing in the north that was scheduled for the same night. Patton then called Bradley and told him, in language characteristically his own, that he was across. He asked Bradley not to tell anyone yet. The desire to steal a march on Montgomery, even by hours, was entirely in character. Montgomery's crossing at Wesel on the night of the 23rd and 24th of March, Operation Plunder, was a massive combined operation involving 2 full armies, 1,000 bomber sorties, and an airborne assault by the 18th Airborne Corps. A set-piece operation of the kind that Montgomery had planned and executed throughout the war, thorough, expensive in preparation, and militarily effective. Both crossings were successful. The rhetorical competition between the two approaches, Patton's dash versus Montgomery's deliberation, has echoed through the literature ever since. With Allied forces across the Rhine, in multiple places by late March of 1945, the operational picture changed rapidly. The German army in the west was now fighting defensive battles in its own territory against an enemy that had complete air superiority, overwhelming artillery, and a logistical base that, with Antwerp now fully operational, was no longer the constraint it had been. The Ruhr industrial region, the beating heart of German war production, was encircled by Allied forces in the last days of March, trapping more than 300,000 German soldiers in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. This was larger than Stalingrad in terms of the number of men eventually captured when the pocket surrendered in mid-April. The German Army Group B ceased to exist. Field Marshal Walter Model, its commander, refused to surrender and took his own life in a forest east of the Ruhr. Eisenhower's decision in late March to halt the main Allied advance and not attempt to capture Berlin is the most controversial strategic decision of his entire command, and I want to address it with the care it deserves. The decision communicated directly to Stalin in a cable on the 28th of March, bypassing Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff in a procedural irregularity that caused its own political storm, was based on the assessment that Berlin was not a military objective worth the casualties of a frontal assault. The post-Yalta agreements had already assigned Berlin and the surrounding territory to the Soviet occupation zone, taking Berlin at the cost of potentially 100,000 casualties, and then handing it to the Soviets anyway seemed to Eisenhower militarily senseless. He directed the main Allied effort south toward the supposed National Redoubt in Bavaria, an Alpine fortress complex where Allied intelligence believed the Nazi leadership might attempt a last stand. The redoubt turned out to be largely a myth. Berlin fell to Soviet forces in late April. Churchill, when he learned of the cable to Stalin, was furious, both at the procedural breach and at the strategic decision. He believed, with considerable prescience, that capturing Berlin had political significance for the post-war order that went far beyond its immediate military value. A Western Allied presence in Berlin, in Churchill's view, would have given the Western powers significantly more leverage in the post-war negotiations over the occupation zones. Eisenhower's response was that military commanders weren't responsible for political post-war arrangements. Those were matters for the governments. This was technically correct within his terms of reference and has been criticized ever since as a dangerously narrow reading of a supreme commander's responsibilities. I don't think there's a clean answer here. Churchill was probably right about the political consequences. Eisenhower was probably right about the military calculus. The tragedy is that both things can be true simultaneously. By early April of 1945, American forces were encountering something that changed the psychological character of the war's final weeks. In the forests and fields of central Germany, they were finding the concentration camps. Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, was liberated by American soldiers of the 4th Armored Division on the 4th of April. The soldiers who arrived there were, by every account, unprepared for what they found. Eisenhower went to Ohrdruf personally, and then to Buchenwald. He ordered every American officer and soldier in the vicinity who was not in the line to come and see. He cabled Marshall and asked for members of Congress and journalists to be sent immediately, so that the evidence would be witnessed by those who could ensure it wasn't denied later. His message to Marshall was direct. The things he had seen were beyond what any communication could adequately describe, and the only response was to make sure they were seen by as many credible witnesses as possible while the evidence was still present. He understood that he was, in that moment, not just a military commander, but a witness to history. The practical military situation in April of 1945 was one of rapid advance and mounting, disorganized German surrender. Entire German divisions were surrendering to American units, sometimes approaching American positions voluntarily rather than Soviet ones. The distinction mattered enormously to German soldiers and civilians who had a well-founded fear of what surrender to Soviet forces. After years of war on the Eastern Front that had been conducted with a ferocity and a disregard for the laws of war that dwarfed anything in the West might mean. Eisenhower held firm to the agreements made at Yalta. German forces surrendered to whichever Allied army they encountered, and the occupation zones remained as agreed. This was, again, a politically constrained decision that some of his subordinates found frustrating. It was also the right decision for the stability of the post-war order that the Allied governments were trying to construct. Chapter 11. The fall of the Reich and the weight of victory. Germany surrendered unconditionally at 2:23 in the morning on the 7th of May, 1945. The signing took place in a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, that was serving as Eisenhower's forward headquarters. The German delegation was led by General Alfred Jodl, the Wehrmacht's chief of operations, who signed on behalf of the German High Command in the presence of Allied officers from all four major Allied nations. Eisenhower himself was not present in the signing room. He received the German delegation afterward in his office. His question to Jodl was direct. Did the Field Marshal understand the terms of the surrender instrument? And was he personally prepared to ensure that German commanders in the field complied with them? Jodl said yes. The war in Europe was over. The message Eisenhower sent to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London after the signing has become one of the more noted documents in military history, precisely because of its refusal of grandiosity. He had been working on a more elaborate communique for days. What he finally sent, by his own account because the elaborate version seemed false, was, the mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241, local time, May 7th, 1945. That's it. 8 years of professional preparation, 3 years of active command, the largest military coalition in the history of the world. And the report of its culmination was one sentence. I find this, every time I read it, the most revealing single document in the Eisenhower record. The complexity of the final weeks before the surrender was not captured by that single sentence. There was still fighting. German forces on the Eastern Front were, in many cases, continuing to fight Soviet forces while surrendering to Western Allied units, a situation that required careful management to avoid the appearance that the Western Allies were somehow facilitating German resistance in the East. There were the practical problems of more than 5 million German prisoners of war, the displaced persons crisis across Central Europe, and the immediate humanitarian catastrophe in the liberated concentration camps. There was the political minefield of governing an occupied Germany, with occupation zones that hadn't been physically demarcated, civilian administrations that needed to be built from scratch, and a population that was simultaneously defeated, traumatized, and, in a significant minority of cases, still actively Nazi. Eisenhower had been managing wartime coalition. Now he had to manage occupation, which was in many respects harder. The question of denazification, the systematic removal of Nazi Party members from positions of authority in post-war Germany, was one that Eisenhower and his staff had been planning for, with varying levels of thoroughness, for more than a year before the surrender. The policy that was implemented, broadly, was to remove all members of the Nazi Party from any position of authority and to screen German personnel for war crimes before allowing them to take any role in the occupation administration. This policy was applied with varying consistency by different theatre commanders and different occupation zones. The American zone's implementation has been both praised for its initial thoroughness and criticized for what happened in the late 1940s when Cold War priorities began to override denazification priorities. Eisenhower was the supreme commander during the critical early months. The foundation he set, a genuine insistence on the seriousness of the undertaking, including the mandatory witnessing of the camps, was real, even if later implementation fell short. The displaced persons problem was, In its scale and human complexity, perhaps the most overwhelming non-combat crisis Eisenhower faced after the surrender. Across Central Europe, there were roughly 11 million people who were not in their home countries and couldn't or wouldn't return to them. Forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war from a dozen nations, refugees who had fled the advancing Soviet forces, ethnic Germans expelled from territories now under Polish or Czech administration. Some of these people were in a condition of acute medical emergency. Some were stateless in a legal sense that existing international frameworks hadn't anticipated. The resources available to address this crisis, the food, the medical personnel, the administrative capacity, were nowhere near adequate. Eisenhower pressed Washington for more resources and for clearer policy guidance. He got some, he got less than he needed. The particular situation of Jewish displaced persons in the American occupation zone was an area where Eisenhower's direct intervention made a significant difference. A report from Earl Harrison, the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, sent by President Truman in the summer of 1945 to assess conditions, found that Jewish survivors in the camps were being treated essentially the same as German prisoners of war, held in the same facilities, fed the same rations, administered by the same bureaucratic procedures. Harrison's report was devastating in its specificity. Truman forwarded it to Eisenhower with a personal message that made clear he expected improvement. Eisenhower was stung, genuinely stung by accounts of his reaction, and moved quickly to establish separate facilities for Jewish displaced persons, with conditions that acknowledged the specific nature of what they had survived. This wasn't an insignificant administrative adjustment. It was the difference for some of the most brutally treated human beings in the history of the 20th century, between being processed as a category and being recognized as individuals with specific, extraordinary needs. The post-war German civilian food supply was another crisis that doesn't feature prominently in popular histories of the period. The German agricultural and distribution system had been severely disrupted by the war. In the immediate post-war months, parts of the occupation zone were facing genuine food shortages. Eisenhower, who had spent his entire career thinking about logistics, understood the problem clearly. He also understood, from a strategic perspective, that a starving German population was not a population that was going to cooperate with occupation, rebuild democratic institutions, or serve as a buffer against Soviet expansion. The humanitarian and strategic interests aligned. He pushed for food imports and for the rapid restoration of the German agricultural distribution system. This practical, unsentimental approach, take care of the population because it's the right thing to do and because it serves the strategic objective, was characteristic of him throughout. In June of 1945, Eisenhower returned to the United States for a series of public appearances that were, in intensity and warmth, unlike anything in American public life since the end of the First World War. He addressed a joint session of Congress. He rode through Washington and New York in ticker-tape parades that drew crowds in the millions. In Abilene, Kansas, the town that had produced him, the reception was, by all accounts including Eisenhower's own, the one that moved him most. He wasn't a demonstrative man in public. He was in Abilene. He said to the people of the town where he had grown up that he had never forgotten where he was from and that he had tried to be worthy of it. This is not a quote I can verify to a specific transcript, and I won't fabricate one. But the substance of what he said in every account of the Abilene reception was something close to this. Gratitude for the values he had been given, and a feeling, after everything, of coming home. The shadow of what came next. The Cold War, the nuclear standoff, the political career, the presidency, was already forming in the summer and autumn of 1945. though Eisenhower himself probably didn't see it clearly. What he did see, with the precision of a man who had spent 3 years managing the alliance between Western democracies, was that the Soviet Union was not going to be a cooperative partner in building the post-war order. The experience of the final months of the war, the Yalta agreements, the Berlin question, the occupation zone negotiations, the way in which Soviet forces had treated both German civilians and, in some cases, liberated Allied prisoners of war, had given him a clear-eyed view of what the relationship with Moscow was and wasn't. He was not naive about it. He wasn't hostile by temperament either. He was simply, as always, practical. The Soviet Union was going to be the central strategic problem of the next era, and the United States was going to need a coherent approach to it. The final act of Eisenhower's Second World War command, the formal Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September 1945, which he witnessed from his role as Army Chief of Staff successor to Marshall, marks, in a biographical sense, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another that this documentary will address in its later chapters. I want to end this chapter with something that might seem small, but that I find persistently significant. In the months after the German surrender, Eisenhower was visited by numerous journalists, politicians, and former military colleagues, all of whom, in one way or another, asked some version of the question. What had been the hardest part? The answer he gave, in different formulations but consistent substance, was not Omaha Beach, or the Ardennes, or the Rhine crossing, or the command fights with Montgomery. It was the decisions made in the planning rooms, the decisions made in advance, before the battle, where you calculated the likely casualties and accepted them as the cost of an objective. Sitting in a room and doing that arithmetic, he said, was the hardest thing he ever did. I believe him. Chapter 12. After the war. NATO, Colombia, and the road to the presidency Dwight Eisenhower came home from the war as the most admired soldier in the Western world, which is a condition that creates its own particular set of problems. The adulation was genuine and the affection was real, but admiration at that scale becomes fairly quickly a political resource that other people want to access and deploy. Both the Democratic and Republican parties approached Eisenhower about the presidency before the 1948 election. Eisenhower declined both overtures. He was, at this stage, genuinely uncertain about his own political affiliation. He had not voted in a presidential election in decades by his own account, and he later said that he had never thought of himself in partisan terms. This isn't as unusual as it sounds for senior military officers of his generation. The tradition of professional military service specifically discouraged public political allegiance, but it made him a uniquely ambiguous figure in the post-war political landscape, simultaneously courted by everyone and committed to no one. In November of 1945, Eisenhower succeeded George Marshall as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the senior uniformed position in the service. It was, in some respects, the least satisfying major command of his career. He was now managing the most rapid military demobilization in American history, as millions of soldiers who wanted to go home were going home at a rate that stripped the army of combat capability with bewildering speed. By 1947, the United States Army had shrunk from more than 8 million men to fewer than 1 million. The professional army that Eisenhower had helped build, and that had fought across Western Europe, was essentially dissolved in less than 2 years. This was driven by genuine public and congressional demand, and by the entirely reasonable desire of millions of individuals to get on with their lives. But the strategic consequences, the United States demobilizing to near impotence at exactly the moment that Soviet power was consolidating across Eastern Europe, alarmed Eisenhower deeply. He said so, in testimony before Congress and in private correspondence. with a directness that the political climate of 1946 and 47 was not always ready to hear. He resigned as Chief of Staff in February of 1948 and became president of Columbia University, a transition that was, in its cultural logic, bizarre enough that it requires some explanation. Eisenhower was not an academic. He was not a publishing scholar. He hadn't completed a graduate degree. The Columbia trustees and faculty who selected him knew this. What they wanted, what they were buying, in a sense, was his name, his reputation, and his demonstrated ability to lead large, complex organizations with competing internal factions. Columbia in the late 1940s had significant institutional challenges, including financial pressures, faculty tensions, and a need for a public profile that could compete with the fundraising environment of the post-war university landscape. Eisenhower provided the profile. Whether he was happy at Columbia is a question his biographers have answered with varying degrees of charity. The honest answer is probably not particularly, though he found aspects of it genuinely interesting, and he brought real energy to certain initiatives, particularly around the American Assembly, a forum for national policy discussion that he established in 1950 and that continued operating for decades after his presidency. His tenure at Columbia was interrupted, eventually permanently, in practical terms, by a request from President Truman in December of 1950 to return to active service as the Supreme Commander of the newly established North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces in Europe. NATO had been created in April of 1949 as a collective defense alliance of the Western democracies, but it was still more of a political and doctrinal framework than a functioning military organization. It had no integrated command structure, no standardized procedures, no combined logistics system. Eisenhower's task was to create one, to do, in the early 1950s, for the standing peacetime defense of Western Europe what he had done in 1944 for the invasion of it. He accepted. He took up the NATO command, formerly designated Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, in January of 1951. The creation of the NATO military structure is one of those history-changing institutional achievements that is almost completely invisible in the popular record because it succeeded. When something works, when Western Europe doesn't get invaded by the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the mechanisms that prevented the invasion don't generate the kind of dramatic narrative that invasions do. But the integrated command structure, the standardized procedures, the interoperability between the military forces of 12 different nations that Eisenhower and his team built between 1951 and 1952. These were not automatic or inevitable. They required exactly the same skills that had built the Shaif Command in 1944. Coalition management, institution building, the patient daily work of finding common ground between allies whose interests didn't perfectly align. He was very good at it. He had been very good at it for 30 years. The question of the presidency became unavoidable by 1951. Both parties were still interested. The critical question was whether Eisenhower was a Democrat or a Republican, because that would determine which party's nomination was available. The answer, when it came, was Republican, announced in January of 1952. The decision was driven partly by Eisenhower's own broadly conservative instincts on fiscal policy and the role of government, and partly by the specific political context. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, the dominant figure in the Republican Party's isolationist wing, was the leading Republican candidate for the presidency, and a Taft presidency, Eisenhower was convinced, would mean American withdrawal from the NATO commitments that he had just spent 2 years building. That, to Eisenhower, was not acceptable. He was running, in a meaningful sense, to protect NATO as much as to seek the presidency. The Republican primary campaign of 1952 was fiercely contested. Taft was the candidate of the Republican establishment and of the party's conservative base. Eisenhower was the candidate of what was then called the modern or internationalist wing of the party. Business-oriented, globally engaged, supportive of the basic architecture of the post-war international order. The delegate fight at the Chicago Convention in July of 1952 was genuinely close and involved contested delegation credentials and procedural fights that were eventually resolved in Eisenhower's favor. He won the nomination on the first ballot. He chose Senator Richard Nixon of California as his running mate, a choice made partly for regional balance, partly for Nixon's aggressive anti-communist credentials, and partly one suspects because Eisenhower thought he could manage Nixon's more combustible tendencies within a disciplined administration. That turned out to be a partially correct calculation. Eisenhower's campaign against Adlai Stevenson in the general election of November of 1952 was, by the standards of American presidential campaigns, unusually substance-focused, which is not to say it was without its negative elements, because it wasn't. Nixon's role as the campaign's attack dog allowed Eisenhower to maintain his above-the-fray image, while the partisan work was done below his level. The campaign's central promise on the most pressing issue of the moment, the Korean War, which had been grinding through its second year with no end in sight, was a personal one. If elected, Eisenhower would go to Korea himself and find a way to end it. The phrase, "I shall go to Korea," became the most effective single sentence of the 1952 campaign. He was elected with more than 55% of the popular vote and carried 39 states. I want to end this chapter not with the election results, but with something that happened in the months between Eisenhower's announcement as a candidate and his inauguration, specifically his relationship during this period with the outgoing Truman administration. Truman, who had hoped Eisenhower would run as a Democrat and who felt personally burned by the Republican choice, was not warm toward Eisenhower in the transition period. There is documented evidence of real personal friction between the two men, rooted partly in the specific tensions of the final year of the Korean War and partly in Truman's conviction that Eisenhower had been insufficiently loyal to Marshall during the McCarthy period. A charge that, by most historians' assessment, was at least partially fair. Eisenhower had failed to publicly defend Marshall against McCarthy's attacks during the campaign, a silence that he later acknowledged privately as one of his deepest professional regrets. The relationship between the two men was never repaired. History's assessment of both of them in the decades since has been considerably kinder to each than either was to the other. He was inaugurated as the 34th President of the United States on the 20th of January, 1953. He was 62 years old. He had spent 38 years in uniform. He had commanded, at the height of his authority, more than 3 million men. He had held the Western Alliance together through the most destructive war in human history. And now he was beginning what turned out to be the most consequential civilian role of his life. A role that would take everything he had learned about coalition, about institutional management, about the relationship between military power and national purpose, and apply it in conditions that were, in some ways, more complex than anything he had faced in Europe. The story of what he did with the presidency is the next chapter, but the presidency, both its achievements and its limitations, only makes sense if you understand the man who walked into the White House in January of 1953. An understanding that man requires everything we have covered in the 12 chapters that came before. Chapter 13, The Presidency, Cold War, Korea, and the Art of Restrained Power. There's a version of the Eisenhower presidencies that dominated the historical narrative for roughly 2 decades after he left office in January of 1961. In that version, the 1950s were a kind of long afternoon nap, prosperous, calm, intellectually unchallenging, presided over by a benign grandfather figure who played golf while his subordinates ran the government. This reading was not entirely invented. Eisenhower cultivated it deliberately and with considerable sophistication. He understood something about the presidency that his successors frequently forgot: that the appearance of effortlessness is itself a form of power. A president who looks like he's struggling is a president whose authority is visibly eroding. Eisenhower's public calm was not incompetence. It was strategy. The classified record, when it was declassified over the following decades, revealed a man who was actively, continuously, and often secretly in command of the most consequential decisions of his era. Korea was the first test. He had promised to go to Korea, and he went. In December of 1952, before he was even inaugurated, making a 3-day visit to the front that was kept secret until he had safely left. What he found confirmed what he had suspected. The war was a stalemate with no military solution available under the constraints then in place, and the human cost of continuing it was not justifiable in terms of the strategic gains available. The armistice negotiations at Panmunjom had been grinding on since July of 1951. The central sticking point was the exchange of prisoners of war. Specifically, the question of whether prisoners who didn't want to be repatriated to North Korea or China could refuse. The communist side said no. The Americans said yes. Both positions had principled foundations, and neither side had moved in months. Eisenhower's approach to breaking the deadlock was characteristically indirect. He made clear, through back channels, that the United States was prepared to consider the use of nuclear weapons if the armistice negotiations failed. Whether this nuclear signaling was the decisive factor in the eventual armistice, signed on the 27th of July, 1953, is debated by historians. That it was a factor seems, from the documentary record, probable. The Korean armistice established the central paradox of the Eisenhower presidency. A man who had commanded the greatest military operation in history was determined, as president, to avoid war wherever possible, not from weakness, but from a precise, hard-earned understanding of what modern war actually cost. He had seen it close up, in the rubble of European cities, in the faces of the men at Ordroof. He knew that the glamour of military victory and the reality of military victory were not the same thing. His national security policy, the New Look, as it was called, was built on a specific strategic logic that the United States could not afford to maintain the standing conventional forces necessary to respond to every Soviet provocation on the ground, and that the credible threat of massive nuclear retaliation was therefore the most cost-effective deterrent available. Critics of the New Look argued, with some justice, that it was a strategy of bluff, that the United States couldn't actually use nuclear weapons in response to a Soviet conventional move into, say, Berlin, without triggering a general nuclear exchange. Eisenhower understood this tension. He managed it for 8 years without a nuclear war. The management was the achievement. The CIA covert operations of the Eisenhower years are a chapter in his record that doesn't lend itself to simple moral assessment. And I want to be honest about that complexity rather than papering over it. The overthrow of the democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 in Operation Ajax was a joint CIA and British intelligence operation that Eisenhower authorized. The overthrow of the Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 was another CIA operation he authorized. In both cases, the rationale was the containment of Soviet influence. Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil was seen as an opening for Soviet penetration, and Arbenz' government had communist members and had accepted a shipment of arms from Czechoslovakia. In both cases, the immediate operational goal was achieved. In both cases, the long-term consequences were damaging to American credibility, to democratic governance in the affected countries, and to the broader project of building a post-war world order based on the rule of law rather than the rule of power. Eisenhower signed the authorizations. The moral weight of the consequences belongs, at least partially, to him. The McCarthy period, the sustained campaign by Senator Joseph McCarthy to identify communist infiltration in American institutions, placed Eisenhower in one of the most difficult political positions of his presidency. He despised McCarthy personally and privately. He thought McCarthy's methods were destructive of the democratic norms that American foreign policy was ostensibly defending. But he was also deeply reluctant to engage McCarthy directly for reasons that were partly tactical. He believed that direct presidential engagement would elevate McCarthy's importance and give him the validation he was seeking, and partly political, since McCarthy had significant support in the Republican Party base that Eisenhower needed. His refusal to publicly defend George Marshall, his old mentor and patron, against McCarthy's accusations in the campaign of 1952 was, as noted in an earlier chapter, something Eisenhower later privately acknowledged as a failure. His strategy of working through back channels and allowing McCarthy's excesses to eventually destroy his own credibility succeeded in the end. McCarthy's censure by the Senate in December of 1954 effectively ended his influence, but the human cost of the years between, the careers destroyed, the institutions damaged, the climate of accusation and suspicion was real, and the question of whether a more direct presidential intervention earlier would have shortened that period is one that historians haven't definitively resolved. The desegregation of the American military had been ordered by President Truman in 1948, but the actual implementation was incomplete when Eisenhower took office. The desegregation of American public schools, mandated by the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954, created a different and more politically explosive challenge. Eisenhower's personal views on desegregation were, by the standards of 21st century assessment, limited. He didn't publicly embrace the Brown decision as morally right. He expressed private reservations about the pace of change, and he was concerned about the political and social disruption that rapid desegregation would produce. But when the crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, came in September of 1957, when Governor Orville Faubus used the Arkansas National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Central High School, in direct defiance of a federal court order, Eisenhower acted. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard, removing it from Faubus's command, and sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to enforce the court order. He did this because the alternative, a state governor successfully defying a federal court order, was a constitutional crisis that no president could permit. He was not at Little Rock acting primarily from conviction about racial equality. He was acting from conviction about constitutional order. The distinction matters. The action also matters. The 9 students entered Central High School under federal protection. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was Eisenhower's most dramatic confrontation with his closest allies. When Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July of 1956, Britain, France, and Israel, without consulting Washington, developed a plan to retake it by force. The operation launched in late October of 1956. In the middle of the American presidential election campaign, Eisenhower was furious. not simply because the operation was militarily and politically risky, but because his allies had lied to him about their intentions. He turned on them with a financial severity that demonstrated, in a way that no amount of diplomatic language could have matched, that the United States was not simply going to endorse whatever its allies chose to do. He threatened to withdraw American support for the British pound, a threat that went straight to the heart of Britain's post-imperial vulnerability, and demanded an immediate ceasefire. Britain and France complied. The Suez Crisis ended. It also ended the British Empire's last claim to independent great power action and clarified permanently the relationship between American and British strategic authority. Churchill, watching from retirement, was reported to have been deeply shaken. Eisenhower, when asked about it later, said only that he had done what the situation required. The launch of Sputnik on the 4th of October, 1957, was the single greatest public relations crisis of the Eisenhower presidency. When the Soviet Union placed the world's first artificial satellite in orbit, a small metal sphere roughly the size of a beach ball, transmitting a regular radio signal that amateur radio operators around the world could detect. The American public's response was, in a word, panic. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, the reasoning went, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on the planet. The missile gap, the perceived Soviet lead in intercontinental ballistic missiles, became the dominant political issue almost overnight. Eisenhower's response was, to the frustration of his critics, relatively calm. He knew something that the public didn't know and couldn't know, that the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft program, flying secret high-altitude missions over the Soviet Union since 1956, had provided photographic intelligence showing that Soviet missile deployment was far behind what the public feared. There was no missile gap of the kind that was being claimed in Congress and in the press. He couldn't say this without revealing the U-2 program, so he absorbed the political criticism, maintained his measured public posture, and pressed ahead with the American space and missile programs without the artificial urgency that his critics were demanding. He was right about the underlying facts. He paid a sustained political price for being right in a way he couldn't explain. The U-2 affair of May of 1960 was the incident that ended any possibility of the Cold War détente that Eisenhower had been working toward in his final years as president. Francis Gary Powers, the CIA pilot flying a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over the Soviet Union on the 1st of May 1960, was shot down near Sverdlovsk, deep inside Soviet territory. The initial American cover story, that a civilian weather research aircraft had gone off course, collapsed when Khrushchev announced that Powers had been captured alive and had confessed to the nature of his mission. The Paris summit, scheduled for the middle of May and representing Eisenhower's best chance at a formal agreement with the Soviets on nuclear testing and broader tensions, collapsed before it began. Khrushchev used the incident to humiliate Eisenhower publicly. Eisenhower absorbed it, acknowledged American responsibility for the program, and refused to apologize for conducting intelligence gathering that he believed was essential for American national security. It was not, by any measure, a satisfying end to his efforts at diplomacy. The moment when détente might have come, the moment when the Cold War might have been shortened, passed, and it didn't come again for more than a decade. By the time of his last year in office, Eisenhower was already composing the speech that would define his legacy in a way that no military victory or diplomatic achievement had managed. He had been thinking about the relationship between military procurement and democratic governance for years, thinking about it in the specific, practical way of a man who had watched the defense budget grow throughout his presidency and had consistently tried to restrain it against the combined pressure of the defense industry, the military services, and the congressional delegations whose districts depended on defense contracts. The warning he delivered in his farewell address in January of 1961 about the military-industrial complex was not a sudden insight. It was the distilled conclusion of a career that had begun in a small Kansas town in the 1890s and had taken him to the command of the largest military force in the history of Western democracy. The man who understood military power better than almost anyone in American history was warning at the end of his public life that military power was a danger as well as a defense. That takes a specific kind of honesty. It also took, as the next chapter will show, everything he had learned. Chapter 14, The Military-Industrial Complex. The warning that defined a legacy on the 17th of January, 1961, 3 days before John F. Kennedy's inauguration, Dwight Eisenhower sat down in front of television cameras in the Oval Office and delivered a farewell address to the American nation. He had been working on it in various drafts for more than a year. The speech is remembered today primarily for a single phrase, the military-industrial complex. But the full text is considerably richer and more specific than that phrase alone suggests, and it deserves to be understood in its entirety rather than through the lens of the single term that survived it. The address was, among other things, the most honest public accounting of a presidency's limitations that any American president had ever delivered, and it was made, characteristically, by a man who had no further political ambitions and nothing to protect by softening the truth. The specific concern that Eisenhower was raising wasn't abstract. He had spent 8 years watching it happen from the inside. The American defense establishment, the combination of the military services, the defense contractors who supplied them, the laboratories and universities that conducted defense research, and the congressional members whose districts and states depended on defense spending, had, by 1961, become a self-sustaining system with its own institutional momentum. Each service wanted more of everything: more aircraft, more ships, more missiles, more personnel, more budget. Each contractor had a business interest in expanding its contracts. Each congressman had a political interest in keeping the production lines in his district running. The individual pieces of this system all made local sense. The aggregate produced a defense budget that, Eisenhower believed, was larger than strategic necessity required, and that was distorting the broader American economy and political culture in ways that hadn't been adequately acknowledged. There's a version of this warning that has been appropriated over the decades since by both the political left and the political right. And I want to be careful about the historical context. Eisenhower was not arguing that defense spending was inherently wrong or that the Soviet threat was imaginary. He had spent his presidency maintaining American nuclear deterrence and expanding the intelligence capabilities that informed strategic decision-making. He believed in a strong American defense. What he was arguing was something more specific and, in some ways, more subversive. That the process by which defense priorities were determined had been captured by interests that were not primarily strategic. That the military-industrial complex generated its own demand. That the weapons systems, once developed and produced, created political and institutional constituencies for their continued existence, regardless of their actual strategic necessity. That a democracy couldn't make clear-eyed decisions about national security if the institutions responsible for those decisions had been fundamentally compromised by their financial stake in particular outcomes. He was also warning about something he called the scientific technological elite, the community of academic researchers, government laboratories, and defense contractors who were increasingly central to American military capability. This part of the farewell address is less often cited than the military-industrial complex passage, but it's equally prescient. Eisenhower was concerned that the scale of federal research funding was distorting the independence of American universities and scientific institutions. The academic research priorities were increasingly shaped by government and defense contracts rather than by the disinterested pursuit of knowledge. This was again not an argument against defense research. It was an argument that the conditions under which that research was conducted mattered for its quality and its integrity. The concern was structural, not conspiratorial. Eisenhower had tried, throughout his presidency, to hold the defense budget to what he believed were strategically rational levels. He had repeatedly resisted service requests for additional spending, particularly on conventional forces that he believed were being replaced by the nuclear deterrent. As the primary instrument of great power competition, his New Look strategy was in part a budget strategy. The massive retaliation doctrine was cheaper than maintaining the conventional forces that would be needed to match the Soviet Army division for division. He took considerable domestic political criticism for this, particularly after Sputnik, when the missile gap debate gave his opponents a compelling argument for more defense spending. He held the line, mostly because he believed the critics were wrong on the strategic facts and right only on the political optics. The restraint he exercised is one of the less celebrated achievements of his presidency, precisely because restraint, by definition, doesn't produce the kind of dramatic narrative that spending and building do. The speech was drafted by Malcolm Moose, a political scientist on Eisenhower's staff, working from Eisenhower's own detailed notes and through multiple revisions that the president himself personally reviewed and amended. The phrase military-industrial complex was almost military-industrial congressional complex. The congressional element was dropped, apparently on the grounds that attacking Congress directly would be politically distracting. Whether the inclusion of the congressional dimension would have made the warning more specific and actionable, or simply more politically toxic, is an interesting counterfactual. What's clear is that Eisenhower understood that Congress was part of the system he was describing, not simply a potential check on it. The omission was a political calculation, not a failure of analysis. The reception of the farewell address in January of 1961 was respectful, but not, in the immediate aftermath, particularly dramatic. The country was excited about Kennedy's inauguration and the new administration's promise of vigor and innovation. Eisenhower's farewell, with its sober warnings and its backward-looking perspective, seemed like the natural valediction of an older era. It wasn't until the Vietnam War, until the precise dynamics that Eisenhower had warned about became visible in the procurement choices and strategic calculations of the mid-1960s, that the speech's significance began to register with its full weight. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the farewell address had been rediscovered and was being read with the specific attention of people who had watched the military-industrial complex operate in Vietnam and recognized exactly what Eisenhower had been describing. The timing of the speech's cultural rediscovery after the damage it warned about had already occurred is one of the sadder patterns in the history of American strategic thought. There's a parallel warning in the farewell address that I think is, in the long run, even more significant than the military-industrial complex passage. Eisenhower warned against allowing the pressures of current crisis to become a permanent condition, against what he called living only for the moment and plundering the resources of future generations for present security. He was talking about the national debt and the long-term fiscal consequences of sustained high defense spending. But the principle extended further. A democracy that organizes itself permanently around crisis, that treats emergency conditions as the normal condition of governance, loses something essential. It loses the capacity for deliberation. It loses the space for the kind of patient, long-term thinking that produces durable solutions rather than tactical responses. Eisenhower had spent 8 years trying to govern in a way that resisted the permanent emergency mode, and he was using his final address to explain why he thought the attempt had been worth making, even when it had been politically costly. The transition to the Kennedy administration was, personally, difficult for Eisenhower. Kennedy was 35 years younger than he was. Kennedy's team, the best and brightest, as they were called, the Ivy League intellectuals and former academics who surrounded the new president, didn't hide their conviction that the Eisenhower years had been a period of missed opportunities and insufficient dynamism. McNamara, Bundy, Rostow. The names of the Kennedy National Security Team became, in the decade that followed, associated with some of the most consequential strategic errors in American history, including the escalation in Vietnam that led to the deaths of more than 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. Eisenhower, watching from retirement, was not silent about his concerns. He met regularly with Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs disaster in April of 1961, and gave advice that was, by Kennedy's own account, straightforward and useful. He met with Lyndon Johnson during the early escalation of Vietnam and expressed, in private, deep reservations about the direction of the war. Whether those reservations were adequately communicated and whether they were adequately received is a matter of historical record that doesn't reflect entirely well on either side of those conversations. The farewell address has been cited, quoted, and referenced by American politicians of every persuasion in the 6 decades since it was delivered, so often and in so many different political contexts that it has acquired something of the quality of a religious text available for selective quotation in support of almost any position. That promiscuous usage has, paradoxically, both inflated the speech's fame and diluted its specific meaning. What Eisenhower was actually saying, in its specific historical context, from the specific vantage point of a man who had commanded the Western Alliance in the biggest war in history, and then spent 8 years trying to prevent the next one, was precise and demanding, and not easily reduced to a bumper sticker. He was describing a structural problem in American democratic governance, and he was naming it at a moment when naming it might still be useful. Whether the naming was useful enough is, 65 years later, still an open question. Chapter 15, The Final Years. Gettysburg, Memory, and the Long Reckoning. Eisenhower retired to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, after leaving the White House in January of 1961. The choice of Gettysburg was not accidental. He had purchased a farm there in 1950, the only home he and Mamie ever owned. Their first permanent home, in fact, after decades of military life, spent in government housing on one post or another. Gettysburg was also, of course, one of the defining battlefields of American history, the site of 3 days of fighting in July of 1863 that had, as much as any single event, determined the shape of the United States that Eisenhower had spent his career defending. He walked those fields regularly in his retirement years. Whether the proximity to that particular landscape of sacrifice was chosen deliberately as a daily reminder of what military power actually costs, or whether it was simply the product of proximity to Washington and the availability of good farmland, I can't say with certainty. But there's something in the image, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, walking the ridges and fields of Gettysburg. That has a weight to it that I don't want to rush past. His retirement years were not idle, he wrote. He painted, a hobby he had taken up during the war, and that he pursued seriously enough to produce several hundred canvases over his lifetime. Most of them landscapes and portraits, none of them remarkable by professional artistic standards, but all of them revealing a patient observational sensibility that complicates the image of pure executive efficiency. He consulted with his successors, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, with varying degrees of formal regularity, maintaining the kind of access to current events that a former supreme commander and two-term president couldn't entirely avoid. He also began work on his memoir of the presidency, Mandate for Change, and its sequel, Waging Peace, which remain valuable primary sources precisely because they're so characteristic of their author. Thorough, systematic, occasionally dry, and consistently honest about the decisions that were hard, without dramatizing them into something they weren't. His health, which had been a concern since his first heart attack in September of 1955, was a constant background factor in the retirement years. He had survived that heart attack, an ileitis operation, and a mild stroke while in office, a medical record that his staff and his doctors managed with a combination of genuine care and deliberate suppression of the most alarming details, as was entirely normal for the medical management of senior American political figures in the 1950s. In retirement, the heart disease progressed. He had additional heart attacks, each one reducing his physical range while apparently doing relatively little to his mental engagement with the world. Visitors to Gettysburg in the mid-1960s described a man who was physically diminished, but who engaged with strategic and political questions with the same analytical clarity that had characterized him at his peak. He was particularly focused in those years on Vietnam, watching with a concern that deepened as the American commitment expanded beyond what he believed the strategic situation required. Vietnam is the chapter in Eisenhower's legacy that requires the most careful handling, because the historical record here is genuinely complicated. Eisenhower had, during Fisher-Price's presidency, significantly increased American military and financial aid to South Vietnam, committing American military advisors to support the South Vietnamese government against the communist insurgency in the South and the government in Hanoi. The number of American military personnel in Vietnam when he left office in January of 1961 was roughly 900, a small number, but the commitment it represented was not small. Kennedy expanded it, and Johnson transformed it into a full-scale war. The question of whether Eisenhower's initial commitment made the later escalation inevitable, or at least very difficult to reverse, is one that historians have debated since. Eisenhower's own position, in his retirement conversations with Johnson, was that he supported the commitment to South Vietnam, but was concerned about the manner of escalation, particularly the use of large conventional American ground forces in a guerrilla war environment. He raised these concerns. They were not acted on. The relationship between Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, his vice president for 8 years, the man he had selected in 1952, was one of the stranger threads in his post-war life. Eisenhower had never been close to Nixon personally, and his support for Nixon's presidential campaigns was, at critical moments, conspicuously qualified. His answer when asked, at a press conference in 1960, to give an example of a major decision in which Nixon had participated, "Give me a week and I'll think of one," was widely interpreted as a devastating implicit assessment of his vice president's influence, though Eisenhower later maintained it had been a flippant answer taken out of context. Nixon lost the 1960 election to Kennedy. He lost the California gubernatorial election in 1962 and gave what appeared to be a farewell to politics. He won the presidency in 1968, 6 months after Eisenhower's last major hospitalization. Eisenhower's response to Nixon's presidency, including the full revelation of Watergate, which began to emerge in the months after Eisenhower's death. We can't know directly, but the question of what he would have made of it is one that serious students of his character have engaged with. And the consensus is that the Watergate abuses were precisely the kind of institutional corruption that his entire career and his farewell address specifically had warned against. Julie Nixon. Julie Nixon, Richard Nixon's daughter, married Eisenhower's grandson David in December of 1968, a connection that briefly united the two political families in the way that dynastic marriages have always attempted to resolve political complications through personal ones. Eisenhower, by this point, was spending significant time hospitalized at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He was fully aware of the marriage and, by accounts of family members, genuinely pleased by it. David Eisenhower has written about his grandfather with a combination of familial affection and serious historical engagement that has produced some of the more valuable secondary literature on the Eisenhower period. The family connection to the Nixon presidency, and then to its catastrophic ending, is one of the more painful ironies in the Eisenhower family's experience of post-war American history. He died on the 28th of March, 1969, at Walter Reed of congestive heart failure. He was 78 years old. He had spent his final weeks largely in the hospital, surrounded by family and by a small number of old colleagues. By accounts of those present, he remained characteristically composed. He told his family that he had always loved his country, and he had done the best he could for it, and that he was ready to go. The funeral was held at the Washington National Cathedral on the 1st of April, 1969. His body was then returned to Abilene, Kansas, to the same town where he had grown up, where the wind came through the gaps in the walls, where his mother had read to him from the Bible and told him that war was wrong. He was buried in the place of meditation at the Eisenhower Presidential Center in Abilene, in a military-issue casket, as he had requested, wearing his army uniform. He took no honors with him that he hadn't been given. He asked for nothing elaborate. The last logistical request of the Supreme Commander was entirely in character. The historical reassessment of Eisenhower began almost immediately after his death, and has continued, in waves, ever since. The 1970s brought the declassification of significant portions of the NSC and SHAEF records, and historians like Stephen Ambrose and Herbert Parmet began publishing the comprehensive biographies that replaced the mythologized wartime accounts with something more granular and more honest. The 1980s and 90s brought further declassification and further reassessment. The revisionist school, associated particularly with Fred Greenstein's concept of the hidden hand presidency, argued that Eisenhower had been a sophisticated and active manager of his administration who had deliberately cultivated the appearance of passivity as a political tool. This reading gained considerable traction and remains influential. It has also been pushed back against by scholars who argue that Greenstein's framework overcorrects, that in making Eisenhower too strategically calculating, it turns his genuine personal qualities into mere performance. I think the truth lies, as it usually does, somewhere between the idealized image and the revisionist correction. What the historical record shows, when you spend enough time with it, is a man whose qualities were genuinely unusual in the context of the positions he held. Patience at a level that looked like complacency, but wasn't. The ability to manage huge coalitions of people with different interests, without either domineering them or being dominated by them. An instinctive preference for institutional solutions over personal ones, for building systems and structures that would outlast any individual's tenure, rather than making himself the irreplaceable center of every decision. an honesty about the limits of military power that was coming from the man who had commanded the largest military force in Western history, both credible and courageous. And underneath all of it, always the Kansas formation, the self-reliance, the lack of drama, the sense that the right response to a difficult problem was to work it through rather than to perform your way past it. There is a particular quality in the men and women who shaped the 20th century that I find myself returning to. Every time I spend serious time with figures like Eisenhower, they were shaped by scarcity in a way that produced a specific relationship with both responsibility and restraint. Eisenhower grew up without money, in a town without horizons, and the adult life he built was a continuous negotiation between ambition and the knowledge that the things ambition could reach were genuinely important and genuinely costly. He never forgot the cost. That's the thing about him that I keep finding in the record. Across 6 decades of a life that touched almost everything in the 20th century's central drama, he never forgot the cost. The crosses in the military cemeteries at Normandy, more than 9,000 of them, white marble on a green headland above the sea, mark the price of the decisions he made in 1944. He visited that cemetery after the war. He didn't look away. He looked at it steadily, the way you look at something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. And then he went back to work because that was what the moment demanded. And because that was, finally and completely, what he was. I want to take a few minutes, now that the formal chapters of this story are complete, to do something that documentaries don't always permit themselves. To sit with the question of what it all means. Not in the sense of a tidy lesson, history doesn't produce tidy lessons, but in the sense of asking what the specific particular record of this specific particular life tells us about the conditions under which consequential things get done. The standard frameworks for assessing great military and political leaders tend toward the dramatic. We look for decisive moments, for the ability to inspire, for the kind of grand gesture that photographs well and reads well in a biography. Eisenhower's career consistently resists these frameworks. His most important contributions, the maintenance of the Allied coalition through years of friction and competing national interests, the building of the NATO command structure, the restraint of the defense budget against enormous institutional pressure, the farewell address warning, are all, fundamentally, acts of prevention rather than acts of creation. They are defined by what didn't happen, the alliance that didn't fracture, the war that didn't escalate, the institutional capture that didn't go unchallenged. Prevention doesn't photograph well. It doesn't produce the kind of dramatic narrative that sustains a 4-hour documentary without effort. But it is, arguably, the highest form of leadership available, because it requires you to understand the danger clearly enough to stop it, and then to spend the rest of your life being unable to explain exactly what you stopped. The military-industrial complex warning has, in the 65 years since it was delivered, only grown in relevance. The defense establishment that Eisenhower described in January of 1961 has become any measurable standard larger, more deeply embedded in the American political economy, and more resistant to strategic reassessment than it was when he warned about it. This isn't a political statement of the left or the right. It's a structural observation that people across the spectrum have made in different ways and with different proposed remedies throughout the period since. What makes Eisenhower's warning uniquely powerful is its source. Nobody could accuse him of being naive about military necessity, or hostile to defense, or insufficiently patriotic. He had commanded 3 million men. He had authorized operations that cost thousands of lives. He knew, from the inside, exactly what he was describing. And he described it anyway, in plain language, on national television, on his way out the door. The question of how Eisenhower compares to the other great commanders and leaders of the Second World War era is one that the historical literature has engaged with at length. And I don't want to simply rehearse those comparisons here. What I'll say is this: Churchill had Eisenhower's moral courage, but not his patience. Montgomery had Eisenhower's methodical quality, but not his coalition instinct. Patton had Eisenhower's battlefield aggression, in abundance, but not his strategic self-restraint. MacArthur had Eisenhower's strategic vision, but not his institutional humility. Marshall, perhaps, comes closest. The same systematic development of talent, the same commitment to the task over the self, the same willingness to give credit and absorb blame. It is probably not accidental that the two men who shaped American military leadership most profoundly in the 20th century were, by temperament, the two least theatrical figures in the senior command. The NATO alliance that Eisenhower helped build in the early 1950s, the integrated command structure, the Article 5 collective defense commitment, the standing multinational force, is still functioning. It has expanded from its original 12 members to encompass 32 nations as of the time of this writing. It has survived crises and internal contradictions that its founders couldn't have imagined. It remains the most successful collective security arrangement in the history of international relations. This is not Eisenhower's achievement alone. The diplomatic and political architects of NATO, from Truman and Ackerson to Bevin and the European foreign ministers, deserve their share of the credit. But the military structure that made the political commitment credible, the structure that proved to Soviet planners that an attack on Western Europe would be met by an integrated, coordinated response rather than a cacophony of separate national reactions. That structure bears Eisenhower's fingerprints in ways that the institutional record confirms. The beaches of Normandy are still there. They look, on a calm day in May or June, like any other beach on the northern French coast. Grey sand, grey water, the light coming in low over the channel. If you know what to look for, you can still see the evidence of the Atlantic Wall, the concrete bunker positions in the dunes, the ghost of the German defensive line. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer sits on the bluff above Omaha Beach, 9,386 graves in precise rows, white marble crosses and stars of David on green grass, facing west toward the country the men under them came from. I've been there. I've walked those rows. I don't know how to describe it in a way that's adequate to the experience, so I won't try. What I'll say is that standing there, knowing what you know about the planning and the decisions and the disagreements and the weather and the chance and the cost, standing there makes the abstraction of military history very concrete, very quickly. The men in those graves were real. The decisions that put them there were made by a real man, sitting at a real desk, in a trailer in the English countryside, writing a note that accepted responsibility for all of it in advance. That note is still in Abilene. The campaign maps are still there. The photographs are still there. Eisenhower with Churchill, Eisenhower with Roosevelt, Eisenhower with Montgomery, Eisenhower with the paratroopers on the evening of the 5th of June, his face open and concerned in a way that the formal photographs never quite captured. The record is there for anyone who wants to find it. That's what I hope this documentary has done, above all else. Not to replace the record with a narrative, but to make the record accessible. To take the weight of what this man carried and make it visible in a way that respects both its complexity and its cost. Dwight David Eisenhower, born Denison, Texas, the 14th of October, 1890. Died Washington, D.C., the 28th of March, 1969. Buried Abilene, Kansas, where he started. Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. 34th President of the United States. author of the most consequential military warning in American history, and the son of a man who worked in a creamery and a woman who believed that war was wrong. The distance between those two facts, the creamery and the Normandy beaches, is the whole story. I hope we've done it justice.